All right. Welcome, everyone, to... I can't say a special episode anymore because I've been critiqued for calling things special episodes in the past.
Who's getting mad at you about that?
You'd be surprised. I'll send you a clip later. Today I'm here with a couple of friends of mine, the esteemed Noah Ermett and Peyton Brown. And I, of course, am Zach Wright, and we are going to be reviewing an episode that was recently re-recorded, or like reposted, I should say. But it's a video that's been up for a while. It was on Nuance's channel. And it was a very, very popular video.
Carah. We call her Carah Burrell.
Right, sorry. I can call her Carah. Sorry, the name of the channel is...
Yes.
Okay. But the
TikTok, yes.
The point is, this is a very, very popular video. It got
700,000.
Upwards of about 700,000 views. Noah and I have seen the video. Our friend Peyton here is going to be helping us with kind of blind reaction. He hasn't seen it yet. And so we'll be able to get some funny reactions out of Peyton, hopefully. But I think we're just going to go ahead and get started here, unless you have any other additional thoughts you want to add.
Yeah, this is a really interesting video. It's kind of fascinating to see how they address some of these problems when they know that they're not going to be getting a lot of pushback, and that Eve, who is already doubting, is not going to be yet kind of really questioning their assertions very harshly, right, or directly.
Yeah, so for context, and we'll kind of get a little bit of this, Eve is the member who is going on to the Mormon Stories show. So she's going to be talking with John Dehlin and Carah Burrell.
Mm-hmm.
She is good friends with Carah. She hasn't really interacted with John before, but she's heard of him. And the premise of this entire section, because this is technically one part out of a few I think they've done.
Yes.
They're basically talking with people about how the church is hiding information and discussing how plural marriage is the really, really big one in this one. And we're going to be kind of talking about that. But the problem is Noah's absolutely right when he says that they're talking about the sort of thing, but Carah and John are going to they're going to consistently state things, and they're not going to get any pushback. And as a result, it's going to allow them to say things that are fundamentally wrong or incomplete, and it's going to cause a lot of problems. And it was one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because I don't think what they're doing is right. It seems very predatory in nature, and I just don't stand for that sort of thing.
I was going to say, this is a very special kind of abuse to kind of just be subjected to that when you're trying to ask questions, and then instead someone barrages you with a ton of crap. So
this is abuse for us, man. Like, I had to take this entire hour and a half episode in like 30-second chunks, because as they realize that they're not getting any pushback, they go further and further every time in their assertions, right? And it's just like, it's hard to watch sometimes. But let's dive in.
Hey, y'all.
So, Eve, welcome to Nuance's YouTube channel / Mormon Stories.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Are you excited to be here?
I am.
Are you excited to talk about Joseph Smith?
Sure.
Are you excited to realize that what you were talking about on your mission that we bonded over for so many months was a lot of constructed lies?
Oh my goodness, that's so harsh, Carah.
Wow, that's okay. So what you were talking about on your mission is a lot of constructed lies, is the assertion here. And I would challenge Carah to find the constructed lie and preach my gospel, right? Maybe, okay, I'm not going to deny, maybe some missionaries have promoted narratives that are not completely true, right? But if you look at what missionaries are actually being told to teach and preach my gospel, find the lie, right? Find the lie. You can argue that missionaries should have taught more than what is in Preach My Gospel, right? You can argue that they should have given more details and more data and more information, but constructed lies in Preach My Gospel is a really, really strong assertion that I don't think you're going to be able to back up.
Right, and I think Preach My Gospel is I'm going to use the same word, constructed, because it's made just so that missionaries don't go beyond and talk about stuff that is not secured.
It's intentionally very simple.
Yes, and it's intentionally simple and so that missionaries have something easy to be able to understand and teach from, and so that investigators can understand it easily as well. It's not meant to go into anything close to the realm of constructed lies. I don't see how it would make that.
And there's a reason that the church has gone away from the recited and rehearsed and memorized missionary discussions that they used to do, right? There's a very good reason that we have the just super, super simplistic and basic version of Preach My Gospel that we have today, right? And we have plenty of supplementary resources available to the missionaries if an investigator does have a question or does want to go deeper on any of these subjects, right? But as far as the basic, simple doctrines of the church goes, there's a reason that Preach My Gospel keeps it so simple, right? And that is what is absolutely going to be the most effective way to teach the simple doctrines that are required for salvation, right?
I guess my thought is that missionaries have a very specific purpose.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, all of us were missionaries. We just like to invite others to come unto Christ by helping them receive the restored gospel through faith in Jesus Christ, repentance, baptism, receiving the gift of the Holy Ghost, and to the end. That sort of thing. They're there to solve the problem, so to speak, of helping people make and keep covenants with God. Whereas historians, people who are, studying this sort of thing, it is their job to solve the problem of teaching the history. And the church provides both as resources, and it is the responsibility of the missionary to provide whoever they are teaching with the resources. But that does not change the underlying factor that the missionaries are there primarily just to help people make and keep covenants with Christ and to improve their relationship with Christ. And I mean, certainly we're more than willing to talk about this sort of thing, and some missionaries are more informed than others. And you're certainly right about missionaries at times being able to propagate misinformation. That said, that is done in spite of what Preach My Gospel says, not because of it, as Carah implies.
As you said, it's just prepare them to help make covenants, right? Specifically, baptism is the main one that missionaries are going to be focusing on.
Right.
And the baptismal interview is incredibly simple, right? All that it's going to say about Joseph Smith is, do you believe that the church and the gospel have been restored through the prophet Joseph Smith, right? You don't need to affirm anything about his character, anything about the nature of Joseph Smith's relationships with anyone, right? It's incredibly simple, and the church's official position is that any of this additional information about his life that's not covered in Preach My Gospel is not necessary to make a judgment on whether or not he was a prophet, right? There are award-winning, very, very well-studied historians in the church who are incredibly familiar with all of the documents regarding Joseph Smith's life, right? And their information, their excess of knowledge there, which we are very glad for and we like, and we study it for fun, is not necessary for them to be able to affirm that Joseph Smith is a prophet, right? Ideally, that's a confirmation that's coming from the Spirit, right? But even people who know all of this information that Carah and John Dehlin are going to present can still affirm, yes, I know all of this and I believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet regardless, right? So it shouldn't be necessary for a missionary to teach every single one of these pieces of information before a person can come to an informed decision over whether or not they think someone is a prophet, right? And this is an argument that I really like that Joseph Lawal makes on whether or not people are rational, right? And he's going to make the argument that a lot of Christians out there just are not, they don't have the capacity to understand a cosmological argument, right? They're just not equipped for that. But we don't want to say that those people aren't rational, right? Just because they're not like super well studied and can't rehearse every single one of the arguments for and against the existence of God, right? We wouldn't want to deprive them of that, saying that they're rational, So we can say that someone who doesn't know every single fact is still acting rationally, right? Is the argument that he's going to make.
So one more thing, and then we can move on. I guess one of the things that they complain about it, they say missionaries are hiding this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if we really want to go down this line of reasoning, though, I would want the critics to provide a comprehensive list of all the things missionaries are supposed to teach before somebody knows enough in order to be baptized. If you're saying that the missionaries are hiding things, it would be their job to say what's comprehensive, because obviously we have all the records here. We have resources we can give them, but I guess in my mind, it just doesn't make a lot of sense because what's going to bother one person may not necessarily bother someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really becomes a matter of the missionary being able to discern the needs of the person that they're teaching. And that comes through consistent interaction. It comes from study. It comes from having genuine discussions with them, having them build connections with other ward members, and having them at least be aware of the resources they could turn to if they do have questions. But I think you're absolutely right talking about how there's certainly a difference between kind of being able to say that you must know X, Y, and Z things in order to be baptized, and kind of what we're saying, where we're saying, we just need to believe in Joseph Smith as a prophet. And that kind of justification for that belief can come from the Spirit. And that, of course, the Spirit manifests in all kinds of different ways, but that's kind of long and short.
And a lot of what you were saying was perfect, that that's going to be different for every person. Some people are going to be able to know a few basic facts and say, oh yeah, Joseph Smith was definitely a prophet. Some people are going to want to study it out for years and years, right? And something that goes along with that is that the way that the information is presented to someone hugely influences how they interpret it, right? The person who is presenting new information to somebody has almost complete control over how that person is going to interpret the new information, right? And we're going to see that pop up time and time again throughout this video, because we have, again, award-winning, very well-known, very well-respected historians in the church who are aware of every single one of these documents. I would go so far as to argue that if you take like the top 50 experts on Joseph Smith and his life and the documents and the primary sources, if not a majority, at least a good chunk of them are faithful, active members in the church, right? Many of them because they worked on the Joseph Smith Papers project, right? So knowing these sources that John Dehlin and Carah Burrell are going to bring up is not mutually exclusive with being an active, faithful member and believing that Joseph Smith was a prophet, right? And so the church, again, their official position is all that you need to know in order to make a informed decision is what's found in Preach My Gospel. And anything beyond that, you're welcome to look into it. You're more than welcome. The church is going to provide you pretty good summaries in the gospel topics essays, which Dehlin and Carah Burrell are going to repeatedly cite, right? Acknowledging that the church does provide resources for these things.
They're also going to say they're hidden, but the full 2 clicks into the church history thing.
But yeah, let's move on unless there's anything else you want to add about this initial assertion.
Well, I was just going to say, like, the church has a really strong push with missionaries to, like Zach was saying, invite members to those lessons, involve them in the teaching process so that missionaries have those resources. Because I remember when I was a missionary for the first long time, I didn't know anything. And many of the things that are considered problems by critics weren't problems to me just because of the culture that I was raised in and the way I understood things. And since investigators or friends who are teaching don't have those, my kind of non-problems with those issues is going to be passed on to them. And I'm not going to be deceitful or
there are some people who just could not care less about these kinds of topics. And I know members of the church who are like this. And sometimes I get confused by how they couldn't care less. But that doesn't change the fact that they could not care less about some of these issues. Yeah. And that's okay. We're not saying that everyone has to prioritize the historical information of the church in the same way in order to be good, valiant, God-fearing people. We are saying that the most important thing is to be able to build a relationship with Christ, and that's what missionaries are trying to do.
There are people who have a priori knowledge, right, that I know the church is true. All of this is just fluff, right? It's interesting to historians, but there are even just very famous historians, well-respected historians out there who are going to say, look, all of this is just like unimportant. It just doesn't matter. I have a priori knowledge that the church is true, and so we can debate over the details and everything, but it's not going to affect my final decision, right? There was one more clip in a similar vein that I wanted to hit before we get into the actual arguments.
We're taught one narrative as either investigators or Orthodox members about Joseph Smith, maybe a simplified, some would say whitewashed version of his history, and a lot of really important facts about his character, about his history, about his behavior is intentionally withheld from us, from investigators, and from missionaries.
One narrative I don't know how you can even assert that we're taught one narrative when, as we've discussed, there is no one narrative. There is no one memorized discussion. Every single missionary is going to teach this differently, and every single person coming into the missionary discussions is going to have different information about the church, about Joseph Smith. They're going to have different assumptions, and they're going to have different worldviews, right? Every single interaction before someone gets baptized is going to look different from person to person, right? And the idea that there's one narrative, yes, there is just one preach my gospel that they're all working off of. But again, there's a reason. That's why they keep preach my gospel so simple, right? Preach my gospel gives you the very basic things that you're going to teach. But then beyond that, everyone is going to have different interactions, right? Everyone is going to have different amounts of Googling that they do before they get baptized, right?
Yeah, and look, history etymologically just means a viewpoint. So as missionaries, that's just the history that they're sharing is the history of the church and of Joseph Smith as they know it. That doesn't make it the history or all of the facts. And certainly there are things with Joseph Smith's character that people can learn on the side. Like I think Richard Bushman points out in Rough Stone Rolling really well that Joseph Smith did have a temper. He got angry a little quick, but he was, which I'll readily admit as well. I can see from a lot of the accounts, but I don't have a huge problem with that because I see all of his peripheral characteristics as someone who is deeply caring, and selfless, and a host of other things that lead me to believe he's genuine and authentic in what he does.
And I think the documentation is very, very clear on that. I always get really confused. I don't know if you're planning on bringing this up right now, but the one thing that really kind of bothers me is to say the church has hidden it from people. Of course, with the advent of the internet, you're going to have some prior information being prioritized just by virtue of the fact that, that's how algorithms work. Mm-hmm. But I mean, they're also talking about back when this gal here was a missionary. We're talking like 10 plus years ago. I'm even thinking of like the 1900s, right? Where we have documentation of the church publishing about this sort of thing in places like the Ensign, in places like BYU Speeches, in places like BYU Studies, and history books. One of the recent things that I got was the Comprehensive History of the Church as compiled by B.H. Roberts. Mm-hmm. And he talks about plural marriage. He talks about the fact that Joseph Smith practiced plural marriage.
Yep.
And we also have Van Wagener, Richard Van Wagener, in the 80s publishing a lot of the stuff that they're talking about in terms of like the number of women Joseph Smith is going to be sealed to. Of course, he wasn't excommunicated for being able to say that. And so we have people talking about this sort of thing. And another example I can provide, the Seer Stone. They make a brief reference to the Seer Stone. That was published in the Ensign repeatedly throughout the 70s and beyond.
And there's a great graph that David Snell does on Keystone where he shows a timeline of all the sources that we have on seer stones, right?
Right.
And there's like tons of them in the 1800s, right? And then it gets a little more sparse in the first half of the 20th century, right? There's like not quite as many, but you can point to at least one, right, in an official church publication interspersed throughout that entire time period. And then it kind of, as archives get opened up and as we get into the internet era, the number of sources about seer stones picks back up again pretty sharply as we're able to access these resources. But at no point is it accurate to say that the church is hiding this, right? We have consistent indication of sources and people who understood the data. We also have people who, just kind of rejected that in pretty high positions in the church, right? But
Cough, Joseph Fielding, cough.
I was going to say the name.
I was actually going to say the seer stones and Joseph Fielding Smith is actually a fantastic example because there's nothing malicious behind that. It's merely just
he just doesn't believe that Joseph Smith used it.
He's not trying to hide it. Yeah.
No, in fact, if you read if you read what he's writing, he knows Joseph Smith owned it. Like he makes a reference to it. He just doesn't think it's used in the translation for the Book of Mormon, and he has his reasons for that. I mean, I don't fully agree with those reasons in his capacity as a historian, but
he's just a bad historian. He's not like trying to hide this document. He's just like, he's just straight up like, he's not very good at accurately assessing the sources here. And he just disagrees. But at no point is he like, nefariously being like, oh, we're going to hide the truth from them. He's just like, no, this is wrong.
And on top of that, the church isn't going to excommunicate people for talking about that sort of thing, because one of those guys publishing the Ensign was a guy by the name of Russell M. Nelson. And
oh wow,
he published an article in the Ensign in I can't remember what decade, but it was in the 1900s about Joseph Smith using the seer stone. He makes a reference to David Whitmer's testimony on that. And so you can't sit here and tell me that when you have people publishing this sort of thing in church publications, there's suddenly going to be silence, because one of those guys is our current prophet at the moment. And so I struggle with being able to see where they're coming from when they talk about the church actively, knowingly, maliciously suppressing this information as a means to the end of being able to, just to like keep everybody in the dark. Because there are people who talk about this. I foresee a potential objection. The 1832 First Vision account, where it was inside the church vault. It wasn't referenced in No Man Knows My History until a later edition because they hadn't discovered it yet.
Sure.
But it's one of those things where the very first time we actually get that published is, again, church. Like it was provided to a BYU student doing his thesis. And the only reason that we start seeing that put in, well, not the only reason, it's actually published quite a few times in the 1900s after that point, but the Tanners got it because they pulled it from that thesis.
Right.
And so, again, it's one of those things where as we're opening up the archives, as we're starting to dive more deeply into the history, and as we're looking at this information from a more holistic point of view, the church looks better, not worse, first of all. And there's a really, really good case to make that at least, by and large, the vast, vast majority of the sources that we have come directly from the church because they're publishing this sort of thing. And it seems irresponsible to say that the church is hiding it.
Right. The church spends millions upon millions of dollars to make all this information accessible in the form of the gospel topics essays, or even just the simple topics and questions section of Gospel Library, which just has short summaries of every little thing. Like that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and money. And I really appreciate the church for doing that because they're not holding anything back. They're just throwing it up.
So John wouldn't disagree with that, but he later on in the video will explain why he thinks that is.
Oh boy. I think also we need to clarify that this is not just like a church unique problem, that archival research is becoming easier, right? This is a very generalized. 50 years ago, the majority of university and other private archives were very, very private, right? We could say that like 80% of them were very private and approved less. I don't know the exact statistics, but I've seen this trend that 80% of them were private and approved about 10% of requests for information, right? And over the past 50 years, with the advent of the internet and people realizing, data should be publicly available, this is a general trend across Western society that has like completely flipped, right? Now it's that like less than 10% of these archives are very private, and even those approve 80% of requests, right? This is not unique to the church that like, the church is nefarious and hiding things in a way that is abnormal. That is just in general, archival research has completely flipped over the past 50 years. You can't attribute any specific nefarious motivations to the church here. That's just how archival research in our culture and context and society has been done.
I was just going to say, we're not going to say Harvard is hiding their history, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we have to look at that from the broader context of just how they kind of treated research in general, and that makes a lot of sense. That's something I hadn't really thought about before, but here, you make a good point.
Yeah, so I don't think it would be fair in any sense to say that like, during the 20th century, the church was nefariously hiding their history. No, that's just how archival research was, and we have a skewed perspective of that because we've grown up in the internet era, right? Where people now have very different standards and understandings of how much data should be public, right? That is, it would be hard to formulate an argument, especially to any historian over the age of 60 who has seen and watched this happening and has seen their job get much, much easier, right?
That's a good point.
Yep.
We'll stop beating the dead horse here, though, but, we're dead taping.
The one narrative idea just does not hold up. But anyway, the next point I had that I wanted to bring up isn't until about the 20-minute mark, where they start to point to the gospel topics essays as like, this is a good resource, right? Because then how are you going to say that like, this is all just a bunch of constructed lies and intentional deceit, but then as soon as Eve asks for sources, say, the church. The church publishes, so It's was there anything before that 20-minute mark that you
So there was one point wherein they basically kind of lambasted her with a lot of information shotgun style.
very quickly?
Yeah, and it was they go into a little bit more information later on in the video, but it did feel very just bam, bam, bam.
Dished out, my beloved.
It's it's that sort of thing can sometimes rub me the wrong way. It's not responsible to do that sort of thing with somebody who has sincere questions and then immediately jump to a different point, as you're saying, when they ask very legitimate questions about sources. And Eve does have some very good questions throughout this, but I also don't think that they're treated with the respect that they deserve.
Yeah, they're gonna at one point give her like 5 or 6 very quick just facts about Joseph Smith polygamy. Let's listen to this.
Carah, do you want to do the reveal?
Yeah. So not only did Joseph Smith secretly marry between 30 and 40 women, but he also lied to his own church, many of his top leaders, to the general public, and to his own wife, Emma, about his secret polygamy. In fact, even though Joseph's polygamy revelation stipulates that the first wife must approve all subsequent wives, aka Law of Sarah, Emma was sealed to Joseph after 20 plus other women were already sealed to him, all without her knowledge. Given Emma's angry reaction while discovering Joseph's affair with 16-year-old live-in servant in the barn, it's understandable why Joseph would keep his first 20 plus marriages from his wife.
Okay, so there's a lot there.
It's like, holy cow, we just covered like 14 different books.
Yeah, it's like 8 hours of video content in 30 seconds.
Or like 30 hours of Mormon Stories content.
Oh, yeah, drag it out.
So there's a lot there. There are a lot of different topics that each could be an entire episode of polygamy, right? And they are just dropping that all on Eve with this very quick, just broad sweeping assertion.
It's like getting waterboarded.
Yeah, all of this is true, and this is the truth about Joseph Smith, right? All of these different assertions about polygamy. And statistically, right, I don't think we're going to disagree with some of these things, like 30 to 40 wives. Yes, that's the correct number. As they point out, that's in the Gospel Topics essay.
And that number's been thrown around for the past 40 plus years in terms of scholarship on polygamy. I already mentioned Richard Van Wagener's work, which is about 40 years ago.
Yep.
It makes a reference to that number.
Yes, and most of the numbers here we don't disagree with, but they're going to, again, promote a narrative, right, about how these numbers connect and what these numbers mean, right? Getting into, if we jump forward to 21 of 14, where Eve starts asking for sources here.
The church now acknowledges in the Gospel Topics essay, they give this number between 30 and 40. That's the church's number now. As far as Emma not knowing about it.
So Dehlin here is, I think this is very interesting because they kind of started this video saying that, you know, it's all just a bunch of constructed lies and intentional deceit on the part of the church, right? But now as soon as Eve asks for sources, they flip and they're like, oh yeah, the church. The church is your source for all of this, right? Even believing scholars widely acknowledge all of this. So that just kind of for decades now, and have been for decades acknowledging this. So this just kind of cracks me up because I think that it is their instinct to do this because sometimes a lot of these more informed people in general who are interacting with some members who are literally just clueless, right? And as you said, like, you could not care less, you know? And we even see this as missionaries sometimes, you know? You're going to have people who just literally could not care. So your instinct is to, let's go to an official church publication, right? Let's see the church themselves on their website. You can find this on lds.org is saying these things, right? 30 to 40 wives. And so that I understand the instinct there, but it's kind of problematic for the narrative that the church is hiding all of this and it's just a bunch of constructed lies, right? But if we can go and point to where the church is saying, yes, 30 to 40 wives. And as you've been saying, Van Wagener, for the past like 40 years, we have BYU theses talking about polygamy, right? For decades, right?
Well, and then on top of that, I mean, we can, I guess if we want, we can throw Todd Compton's work in there. They'll mention Todd Compton a couple times throughout this interview. He's the one that like tries to go through and do a comprehensive list of Joseph Smith, like the number of Joseph Smith's wives. And I mean, obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but he wasn't excommunicated for talking about that sort of thing.
Nope.
And so
Decades ago.
Yeah, and again, decades ago. And so, again, throwing this out, saying that the church has been actively suppressing this information, they also make a reference to like excommunicating people who are talking about this sort of thing. That's just objectively inaccurate. And so I have a really hard time getting behind what John is doing here.
If you're going to get excommunicated, it's probably going to be for practicing polygamy, not talking about it. And, if you're talking about it, the only time you're going to get excommunicated is if you are very intentionally and directly and angrily saying and broadcasting on the internet, right? The church is wrong, the church is lying, the church is harmful, right? The church's polygamy narrative is false, right? But you can absolutely question the narrative, right? In a respectful and considerate way and say, well, I don't know if this date is correct here. You know, that's totally fine. We see faithful scholars doing that still today, talking about this stuff, and we've seen them they have been
Talk about an example of that today, I think.
Oh yeah. But yeah, so it's just it just cracks me up that they're going to say constructed lies, false narrative, intentional deceit, and then immediately turn to the church for sources here, especially when they're going to mention that Eve was a missionary about 10 years ago, right? About the time that the gospel topic essays are coming out. Right. Yeah. So these resources were available or very quickly becoming available. Even if she didn't have access to the gospel topics essays yet, you can Google this. And at that point in 2013, there is going to be plenty of stuff online about this, right? I don't think that it's fair to say that the church is hiding or restricting access to any of this. Church-approved resources too, right? BYU, DC.
I had a question. So I don't know if it's on your clip here, but are we going to talk a little bit about the accusation about Joseph suppressing this information, or like Joseph hiding the practice of polygamy?
What's the timestamp on that?
It might be a little bit after this.
Yeah. I think Emma freaks out super mad about 22 wives that are being married beforehand, right? And then she goes to Hiram, and she's like, "Whoa, we need a revelation," you know?
Well, actually, it's interesting. I was going to talk a little bit about that.
Okay, do you want to do that?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
It's widely acknowledged by believing Mormon scholars that Emma was about the 22nd wife sealed to Joseph. So,
If my husband does that to me,
if he secretly marries 22,
I'm gone. Okay, Casey?
if he secretly marries 22 women before. Also, he married these 22 women before Emma, before he received D&C 132. So eventually, he receives D&C 132, which is the polygamy revelation. He doesn't receive that until after Emma freaks out, is super mad about the 22 wives. And then he goes to Hiram and says, "Man, Emma's really mad. We got to get a revelation." So then he goes to God and dictates D&C 132 to Hiram after he's already married 22 other women. So you would think the revelation would come before the 22 marriages, not after.
Yeah.
So, first off, it is objectively wrong, again, that there's no discussion about plural marriage or the practice of plural marriage, or like Joseph isn't getting his ideas for D&C 132 prior to when D&C 132 was inscribed in July of 1843. And we know this because we have women who are practicing polygamy talking about Emma knowing about it as early as, in May of 1843, and Emma knowingly giving her consent to these women being sealed to Joseph in May of 1843. And interestingly enough, she does this before she herself is sealed to Joseph. So for instance, the sealing of the Partridge sisters and the sealing of the Lawrence sisters was done like early May. And I want to say that the sealing for Emma Smith was done like May 22nd of 1843. And so the question at that point becomes, if this is the case, why is she asking for Joseph to be sealed to these other women before she herself is sealed to Joseph? And then on top of that, you also run into a problem because they made a reference to Fanny Alger earlier. We have documents saying that she knew about Fanny. So on one hand, they want to be able to say, Emma didn't know anything about plural marriage. And then on the other hand, they want to say, Emma was really upset about Fanny Alger and plural marriage. And it's kind of one of those things where you need to pick a lane in terms of what Emma did know and versus when she didn't know. But the problem is that there's just not a lot of good documentation on plural marriage in general. And it's really difficult to be able to say what she did and didn't know about. Like, we can have solid
Since she's going to flip-flop herself, right, and not promote one clear narrative.
It's one of those things where I know what interview you're talking about. There's some question as to how much Joseph Smith III is affecting those kinds of interviews, because those are primarily done via that medium.
Yes.
But I mean, you're not necessarily wrong in where it's abundantly clear that she's vacillating in terms of how she's feeling about the topic of plural marriage. And honestly, I can't really blame her. I don't know how I would react if I was put in Emma's shoes, but I also at the same time, you can't sit here and tell me that Emma did not believe as a result that Joseph Smith was a prophet. And you can't sit here and tell me that she didn't believe that the Book of Mormon was inspired her entire life. And you can't sit here and tell me that because even if we were to go fully into what they're saying and to accept what these critics are saying wholeheartedly, you can't sit here and tell me that Emma didn't believe.
Right.
And that's not something that's talked about often enough in terms of these kinds of discussions by critics.
Because this is their problem, that they say, oh, members should know about this before they get baptized, right? Missionaries should be teaching this. But then it's very clear that the people closest to Joseph Smith who are most upset about this and are struggling with this the most still believe he's a prophet, right? And do so until their deathbed, right?
Yeah.
So then it becomes really tricky to promote the narrative that, like, oh, if you knew about this, you wouldn't be a member, right? I think it's misleading, and it is them pushing us to interpret the data the same way that they do, and specifically feel the same way that they do about the data, right? But yeah, you're absolutely right that we have pretty good data and evidence that Emma absolutely believes Joseph Smith is a prophet and that the Book of Mormon is inspired until the end of her life. And other people very close to Joseph Smith who are very, very, very conflicted about polygamy are going to be incredibly dogmatic that Joseph Smith was absolutely still a prophet, and absolutely the Book of Mormon, at the very least, was still true until the end of their lives.
All right, I have a couple of shotgun things that I want to run by before we keep jumping to another timestamp. So, first, when we're talking about Joseph Smith downplaying the role of plural marriage in Nauvoo, where I want to say that they cite the statement talking about what a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can only find one.
Mm-hmm.
A lot can be said about that. Is Joseph Smith primarily downplaying or denying adultery? In what sense is he talking about wives? Is he talking about it in a legal sense? Is he talking about it in the spiritual plural wife sense? A lot can be said. But, I mean, it's one of those things where for sure he's downplaying it, but you can't use these documents to say that he's lying to Emma, because that statement is given after Emma is approving of plural marriages. And they have records of Emma recommending that, including one of the final ones, Melissa Lott, who we have very, very clear evidence on the part of Melissa saying, yes, Emma knew and consented to this plural sealing. And that one did involve sexual relations on top of that. And so it's one of those things where even if we're going to say that, Joseph is downplaying it, you can't say that, you can't use these kinds of sources to say that he's overtly hiding it from everyone he knows, including Emma, which is what Carah is saying. I take issue with that. As for why he's downplaying it generally, I mean, we don't really have any records from Joseph's journal saying, I'm not telling the general public about this because of X, Y, and Z reasons, because Joseph doesn't really talk about plural marriage much generally. And on top of that, it's one of those things, it's one of those things where we have to make guesses. And it's really easy for us to make guesses. What these critics would say is, oh, he's just downplaying this because he just wants to be able to sleep around. He wants to be able to control the masses. It's really easy to be able to say that. But when we couple that with the idea that we have abundant documentation that the people who are practicing polygamy believe it came from God, and they're doing it not because of any kind of desire to be sexually gratified, but because they believed it was a principle revealed by revelation.
Yes.
That is the primary motivator. And to go beyond that is to go beyond the documentary evidence that we have.
Exactly, because the number one reaction to polygamy, like just at the outset, is usually revulsion. But then as people spend a lot of time around Joseph, or even just thinking about the principle, praying about it, and doing all sorts of things to reason through it, eventually they come to understand it as a religious principle, certainly not a sexual one, just to get gratification or power. No.
And I think that's going to be the main thing that we're going to pound on over and over again here is the reason that we are contesting Dehlin and Carah's narrative is because I think that we have really solid evidence coming up over the past 20 years, especially that Joseph Smith is religiously sincere, right? That he genuinely believes that he is a prophet called of God, that the argument that he's just an opportunist or a con man has kind of been blown out of the water with all of the documents that we now have available to us through the Joseph Smith papers, right? We have evidence that as early as 1831, we can point to multiple sources that Joseph Smith, as he's translating and looking at the Old Testament, right, as part of his translation of the Bible, is wondering about polygamy, saying, is this inspired of God? We have him talking about it. We have other people saying, yeah, Joseph Smith is wondering about this in 1831, right? He is really thinking about this in the context of an inspired principle, right? And the narrative that he is an opportunist and a con man just doesn't hold up. And that's the narrative that Dehlin and Carah are going to repeatedly promote here, right? And
Not even like non-LDS historians are also agreeing with exactly with what you're saying. What was the guy that you were referencing? You were talking about him earlier.
yeah, so with the Joseph Smith papers, we are getting a new biography of Joseph Smith from John Turner, who is a very well-respected...
Turley is a very different person.
But John Turner is a well-respected, award-winning historian who's already done a pretty good biography of Joseph Smith, right? He's a professor at George Mason University and has now been incredibly impressed with and is giving a lot of praise to the Joseph Smith papers, right? And is currently working on, well, he's done with his biography of Joseph Smith. It is coming out next month. And so he's already starting to do a lot of interviews, right? He's going to be doing some panel discussions. He's been very public in saying that this is huge, right? The Joseph Smith papers makes Mormonism the most well-documented religion of any, how do I phrase that? The origins of Mormonism are the most well-documented of any religious movement ever, right? There's no religious movement that even comes close to having the documentation that Joseph Smith does. There is no theophany like the first vision that has nearly as many accounts as Joseph Smith does, right? And so John Turner is over and over again saying, this is fantastic, right? As a historian, this is our dream, right? This is so great. And what he is saying, we haven't read the book yet, right? I'm very excited for it to come out. But what he seems to be indicating is that he is going to talk about Joseph Smith's religious sincerity, right? That it is very clear to him that Joseph Smith genuinely believes he is a prophet and that he has been called of God, and that the things that he are doing are inspired principles, commandments from God, right? Now, we've already seen this over the last 20 years. Even in Dan Vogel's biography, starting in 2003, we start to see Vogel leaning away from the fraudulent, the con man, the opportunist argument, and more towards he's a pious fraud, right? He really does believe he's inspired. And Dan Vogel is actually the guy who really first popularizes this, right? He absolutely does not believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet, right? But he can see, and Dan Vogel is someone who's familiar with the sources, that Joseph Smith does believe this, right? And Joseph Smith is really genuinely sincere in his arguments that polygamy is something that God has commanded him to do. As far as we can tell from the documents, this is something that is coming directly from God. And there's a pretty famous article from about 20 years ago from Lori Maffley Kipp called Tracking the Sincere Believer, Authentic Religion and the Enduring Legacy of Joseph Smith. And it's a chapter as part of a larger anthology edited by Terrell Gibbons, Joseph Smith Reappraisals After 2 Centuries, right? And she kind of just notes that, wow, it's really fascinating the way that in all of these polemics, right, we have a lot of arguments over the sincerity, right? And that especially recently, we're getting more and more data, we're getting more and more complex, stronger arguments in favor of the fact that Joseph Smith was religiously sincere, right? Which Carah and Dehlin don't seem to believe, or if they do accept that he was sincere, they seem to still play along the con man, fraud, opportunist lines of reasoning when they're discussing polygamy, which the sources just don't seem to support, especially as we're going to get into Don Bradley's research.
Right.
Like I want to hear the stories of the women because I want to know, did they want this? Was it something that they were pressured into? I mean, I recently watched the Netflix thing.
Buckle up, girlfriend.
I recently watched the Netflix thing with what's his name?
Warren Jeffs.
Warren Jeffs. That is so creepy and so scary. And you think like everyone's like, oh, well, the church was so persecuted. They were so persecuted for practicing polygamy. But then I look at the case with Warren Jeffs and I'm like, would you be against people going in and trying to break that up? Because that was terrible. And if that's what the church was doing, why are you saying the church was persecuted if they were trying to save women and children? So like, that's how my mind's going right now. And I'm like, I want to know their stories. I want to know.
Yeah, and I think the reason why we wanted to put this one about polygamy in our top 15 things that are hidden is because the general public can look out into the world and they can see obvious cult leaders like Warren Jeffs and just a lot of other cult leaders that you could rattle off the top of your head, that when they accumulate enough power, what are the things that they start doing? And one of the telltale signs is, the top cult leaders, whether it's Warren Jeffs or Joseph Smith, that they start getting underage brides for themselves. And I think it's a general just American who is literate and watches things, you're going to notice these similar patterns. And if you wouldn't be comfortable with it in Warren Jeffs, why are you comfortable with it in Joseph Smith?
Okay, so the assertion is that there are very similar patterns, and literate Americans are going to notice these connections and say that, oh, these are uncomfortably similar, right?
Hey, Noah, what's a literate American? I'm just saying, let's just say like a non-LDS professor. Do we have any non-LDS professors comment?
Yeah, I wonder, it would be really nice, if we had some non-LDS historians who have written at length about polygamy and have maybe, published with a university press on this question. Oh, guess what? We do. Sarah Barringer Gordon is a lawyer by trade, but also does a lot of work on history and has written a book with University of North Carolina Press on the Mormon question, polygamy, and constitutional conflict. So she's looking at it also from a legal angle, but she is going to very directly say that as a literate American, as a University of Pennsylvania law professor and author on Mormon polygamy, that this comparison is very forced, and that like all comparisons, right, it is overly simplistic. So Sarah Barringer Gordon is going to say Smith was a charismatic, larger-than-life figure who was constructing an expansive theological, marital, and economic universe, says Gordon, a legal expert and independent historian who's written extensively on Mormon polygamy. He was a visionary, while Jeffs tried to replicate the life of the prophet, but was twisted in his approach to polygamy and his people, deeply destructive of other people and human dignity and even himself, right? Jeffs inherited religious power and spent his life exploiting it, right? So Gordon is directly saying, look, there are some massive differences between the way that these guys go about what they're doing that we need to be aware of. Obviously, there are similarities, but like all comparisons, the goal of Carah and Dehlin here is going to be to overlook the differences and promote a narrative about the similarities. And it's really it reminds me of the narrative that a lot of Christians have where they're going to try and compare Joseph Smith to Muhammad, right?
That's a common one.
Yeah. You talk to any historian, professor, like expert on history of religions, right? They're going to immediately say, right, but this comparison is very forced, right? We need to look at some of the differences here, right? And there are many more differences than there are similarities. And if we're just looking at the similarities, we're constructing a false narrative. Another interesting point is that I think we see a lot of critics sometimes complaining about members of the church and their parallelomania, right? We're going to see critics saying, oh, Hugh Nibley's engaging in very obvious parallelomania where he's so obsessed with the parallels, right? And the same thing you're going with. Right? So my problem here is that if you're going to complain about parallelomania and only looking at the things in common and the commonalities and the comparisons, we need to also be aware of the differences, right? And people in academia, right, professionals, lawyers, historians are always going to emphasize, look, there's some massive differences that we have to be aware of here, right? Yes, there are similarities. Polygamy is involved in both cases, right? But we absolutely have to be aware of the differences or we're doing ourselves a disservice, right? We're being unfair to Joseph Smith's.
It's I always love the Joseph Smith and Warren Jeffs connection because I just think it's super funny. I think the one thing that I use to really differentiate the two the most is I just read both of their revelations and compare the two and very quickly realize which one is the selfish, diabolical cult leader and which one is a lot more authentic and more selfless.
Read them side by side. It's very clear. One of them is religiously sincere, genuinely believes he's a prophet called of God. The other one seems to be very much an opportunist, motivated by power grabs, right?
And admittedly, I'm partial to being a little unfair to Warren Jeffs. So if I'm gonna be completely honest with you, but you guys are right when you point out that there are some very significant differences. I mean, let's just look at one comparison off the top of my head is how about the complexity of the stuff they're writing?
Yep.
I mean, we have the Book of Mormon, which is a very plausibly, authentically ancient, or at least as you look at it, there are some very significant evidences for its authentically ancient origin. And then also but even if we're going to say that Joseph Smith is making this stuff up, he's incorporating aspects of literary genre. He's creating internally consistent geography. He's doing all kinds of things that warrant this kind of exploration of kind of this mind and this deeper seated theology. And it's my understanding we don't really see that in any comparable way with Warren Jeffs. And so, again, it does feel very forced. It feels like parallel mania, and it's intellectually irresponsible to make that kind of comparison in the way that they're making it.
Yeah, it's forced. It's very forced. It is intentionally, like all comparisons, ignoring the differences in order to construct a comparative narrative, right? And the award-winning historians, the lawyers are going to point out, we need to be aware of these differences, and we are doing ourselves a disservice if we ignore them, right? I think that was the last point that I had that I wanted to bring up. So do you have any more timestamps after that? I think we pretty quickly after Warren Jeffs are going to get into the difference between time only and eternity sealings, which I'm glad they actually make a distinction here. But they kind of brush over it at about the 28-minute mark.
Can we briefly talk about young brides? We're on the topic of
What's the timestamp on that? What's
it's okay. We can just weave this in here in conjunction with this last clip about Warren Jeffs, or we can weave it in with the previous one about Carah shotgunning this. We have the clip for that. I just don't know if I don't know if that's gonna cause a problem for us. But two things. So one, Carah makes a big deal about what she refers to as being underage girls. Unfortunately, when we're talking about the concept of underage, it's very likely she's referring to underage in what? The question at that point becomes underage in what sense? Underage in the sense of like being under the age of consent. Problem is that consent laws are very, very different back then. I want to say that there's an example of like a consent law being like one of the laws of consent in Delaware being like 9 years old.
Yep.
And so it's very, very young. They had a very different conceptualization of what it means for someone to be ready for marriage. It had far more to do with demonstrating competency and like having your mental faculties about you than it did with age. Certainly there's a correlation between those two aspects, but they didn't really have the vocabulary for that sort of thing or the mindset for that sort of thing. And to demonstrate, and also significant age gaps are also a big thing. One need only read a Jane Austen novel to figure that out. We laugh about that, but the book Emma, which isn't nearly as popular as Bride and Branches, but it's a pretty popular book. I want to say there's like a 10 plus year age gap between the main heroine and like her love interest, the guy who she ends up with. Another example, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leiter. So Mary Elizabeth Rollins, you've probably heard of the story of like those girls picking up those pages for the Book of Commandments and hiding in the cornfield. That's her, or she's one of the girls there. But she eventually ends up being one of Joseph Smith's plural wives, or she's sealed to them. But at the time, she's concurrently married with a guy by the name of Adam Leitner. Adam Leitner is not a member of the church, but he's also 8 years older, and they both conceive their first child when she's 17 years old. Unfortunately, the baby dies pretty young, so he doesn't get to live into adulthood. But that would be one more instance of somebody who's not Joseph Smith having a decently sized age gap, but at the same time having those, they must be 18 years old or older. That's not really something that they have on their mind. It has far more to do with maturity and that sort of thing. So that was another thing I wanted to be able to bring up here. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, another thing Carah says is this idea that Joseph Smith is having these these underage girls live in his home, and using kind of power dynamics to manipulate these girls into marrying him and sleeping with him. The problem is that even if we're going by her standards of 18 years and younger, most of the women he's sealed to do not live in Joseph Smith's home.
Right.
The only two that I could find were Sarah Lawrence, who we've kind of already made a reference to, and also Lucy Walker. And Lucy Walker is one of the plural wives I've studied the most, because she's also one of the plural wives wherein we have the best documentation and the strongest evidence of Joseph Smith being sexually active with her. And so it's a convergence of different questions people have. And so I've done a lot of work in Lucy Walker specifically. But she's another example, kind of what you were mentioning, of her having a very powerful spiritual experience of basically believing or having it testified to her that, plural marriage is actually a principle God was commanding. And it's one of those things where, here, 1 second. Some critics try and downplay it. They have a variety of different things. One of the most vocal critics I've seen of that marriage in particular is Burrell. And Bill's wrong on that.
I'm not surprised.
Well, I should be more specific. So, for example, he'll complain about how she was sleep deprived and hallucinating.
Oh boy.
From a psychological perspective, you would have to be forced to stay awake in order to get to that point, because your body will literally start forcing you to fall asleep before that can happen. It doesn't matter how upset you are. It doesn't matter what's going on in your life. If your body has the capacity to sleep, it will sleep after about 48 hours, period. And we don't start getting those kinds of deep-seated hallucinations until after that point. And so there are some significant problems with it. But I also think it's one of those things where I struggle with some of the critics' line of reasoning here, because it's very clear that the people around Lucy Walker, for instance, believe she can consent. So Joseph goes to Lucy's brother, who's rather close with, and brings up the prospect of plural marriage with him, and so he basically says something to the tune of, if she consents to it, I'm okay with it. But that's indicative of the fact that both Joseph and Lucy's brother both believe she can, in fact, consent to it. And so you end up kind of in this weird position of saying, well, no. Lucy can't actually consent to it. Not really. I mean, she's not an adult. She can't have these kinds of experiences that verify this for her. And it feels a little gaslighty to me.
They say
because they say she can.
Okay.
And if the people in that time say she can, then according to again, we're going back from a historical context, that's why they think it's okay. And so being able, the argument being presented by Carah and John here, in the sense that Joseph is overtly manipulating these women and coercing them, is directly challenged by the fact that Joseph is actively involving their family members in this, actively seeking permission. We have records of women turning Joseph down and having no retribution put against them. Examples include Cordelia Morley, Lydia Moon. Lucy Walker herself, who people often cite as being an example, she has a statement saying something to the tune of, every woman has their choice in terms of plural marriage. We can provide sources for that. But
I'll be throwing things up.
I promise you, all of this is validated, and by historical sources, primary sources, some of the best sources that we can pull on this. And the insinuation that Joseph is being manipulative in the sense that we're talking about, in a similar sense that, like Warren Jeffs, when we've been talking about that, and I just don't think that pans out as you look at the information more carefully, as you put it in its context, and as you look at Joseph Smith's and these women's motivation and their capacity to make decisions to further their relationship with God.
There's a great quote from Brian Hales as he's presenting a paper on polygamy at Sunstone a few years ago, and he looks up and he's like, if I could go back in time, I would tell Joseph Smith to do this a little bit differently. Yeah, fair, but the fact that like even Brian Hales, who the critics accuse of being ridiculously dogmatic, right, about defending Joseph Smith and his polygamy, is able to recognize, right, by our standards, a lot of this is very shaky, right? But by Joseph Smith's standards and the standards of the time, the legal standards and even the societal and just social standards, right, we have him over and over again, including the families, right? We have him over and over again saying, yep, totally okay. There's no retribution if you don't marry me, right? Brigham Young is going to be even better about this, with the divorce laws in Utah. We have direct legal documentation of this. And also, I think if we want to talk about the young wives, let's talk about the old wives too, right?
Yeah.
Because Rhonda Richards, 58 years old.
Fanny Young was one of the last women that was sealed to Joseph Smith. She was 56.
56 years old in 1843, right? There's some evidence that he might have married Sarah Marietta Kingsley. That one's shaky, but 53 years old, right? Elizabeth Davis claims that she was sealed to Joseph Smith in Salt Lake. Again, shaky, but 50 years old, right? All of them much, much older than Joseph Smith. So
The question at that point becomes why?
why, right? If you want to promote the narrative that Joseph Smith is an opportunist, what in the world is going on here, right? There is clearly something deeper going on behind the scenes. And Dehlin and Carah are going to make the concession, right? Oh yeah, there's different kinds of plural marriages going on here, right? We don't quite understand why are some of these like time only? Why are some of these for time and eternity? Also, what do plural marriages? What do these sealings exactly mean in this context where they're only just barely figuring out the sealing power, and they're kind of working much more directly to just seal the entire family of God together, right? Not at the Wilford Woodruff style horizontal sealings that we have nowadays, right? There's a very different context for plural.
Made a vertical motion while saying horizontal.
Vertical sealings, vertical familial sealings.
I just want to make sure I understand. Absolutely.
Yes. No, thanks. Parents to grandparents to great-grandparents is the way that we do sealings nowadays, right? But in Nauvoo, that is not how they're doing sealings, right? They're very much more open to these, I think they call them friendship sealings, right? Where people are being sealed into each other's families, right? Because the goal here in these very early days of sealings, just getting this web started, is we just have to connect the entire family of God's children together, right? And so plural marriage, these sealings are being practiced with very different theological motivations, right? I'm not denying there's absolutely a traditional marriage sexual aspect to this as well, right? We certainly see that, but we have to look at this greater context of what are these 58-year-old women doing,
And of the women that we have the strongest evidence of Joseph Smith being sexually active with, the majority of them say that Emma knew about it and consented to it.
Yes.
And that's something that I don't think is talked about often enough.
Let's talk about Joseph Smith marrying women whose husbands were on missions.
And Joseph, get on the wives of women already married to men.
Yeah.
And that's called polyandry, which is different than polygamy or polygyny.
Yeah. And were those men still good, faithful members in the church? They must have been if they were serving missions.
Yeah.
And they know.
Some of them didn't know. Joseph would.
So how? I guess maybe we don't know this, but how would he approach them?
That's its own episode.
It's really interesting. We can go into that in the car. How do you know that?
That's its own episode, right? And it probably should be, because they're going to give a very summarized and overly condensed version here. Their claim is that, of course, as usual, they are telling her all the truth and giving her all the facts and details. But let's go into the data on this claim that Joseph Smith was marrying women whose husbands he had sent out on missions so that he could, sequester them.
So, first off, it's not all of them. I've already made a reference to one of them, Mary Elizabeth Rollins, who's married to a non-member. And when she's sealed to Joseph Smith, husband just doesn't care. He's not a member of church. He's like, all right, honey, you can do that.
Which says a lot about what these sealings meant in that context, as I brought up, right?
And so the only instance where we are seeing this being a controversy is the instance of Orson Hyde. Right. Orson Hyde and his wife, Miranda Nancy Johnson.
Okay.
And the problem is that we have a sealing date of when Orson was on a mission, but we also have a sealing date of when he was not. Different biographers have taken different approaches to that. For example, Todd Compton says that it's more likely that the It happened when he was on the mission or when Orson Hyde was on the mission. But that was before a lot of the research by Don Bradley and Brian Hales was done. In uncovering more details, we actually have a record from, I want to say it was an affidavit by Miss Miranda Nancy Johnson. I keep on trying to mix those up because sometimes when she writes things, she puts Nancy Miranda Johnson, and sometimes she'll put Miranda Nancy Johnson. And so I get my get the names a little mixed up. But the point is, she signs an affidavit basically saying that she was sealed to the prophet after Orson got back from his mission, and that would have happened in 1843.
So the whole controversy between Orson, Bennett, and Joseph with all that fiasco, that's all happening while they're all there, pretty much?
So typically speaking, when we have an affidavit like that, it would take priority over the other sources that would suggest that it's not. Some people have posited that, maybe there was just 2 sealings. That wouldn't be the first time something like that's happened in plural marriage. But there, of course, is a little bit of controversy behind that because Orson Hyde is very quickly after that point jumping into sealings himself with being sealed to multiple women. Oh. And so being able to say that Joseph is overtly hiding these sealings from the husbands, once again, goes against the information that we have. And so you just run into all kinds of problems that just aren't really addressed here, despite the fact they really should be.
Yeah, to back up a bit and look at the big picture here, we have 12 wives of Joseph Smith who are allegedly polyandrous, right? There are 12 women who already have a husband, right? 10 of the husbands are absolutely definitely not on a mission at the time of the sealing, right? And there's insufficient or contradictory information about these 2 that we've talked about, right? Specifically Orson Hyde, because we can identify pretty quickly George Harris left afterwards on his 14-month mission in July, or beforehand in 1840, right? And Lucinda might have been sealed, but that there's not enough data to make any strong arguments. And unfortunately, critics of the church are going to say things like, quote, Joseph Smith would frequently approach other men's wives about being his plural wives, often while the men were away. And that's just not true. At best, we have maybe 1, right, where there is contradictory data, there's 2 potential sealing dates, and there's no good reason to prioritize one over the other, except that we can look at the context of what's going on here and all of these other sealings, because we do have data on the rest of these where Joseph Smith is actively asking the family for permission, right? We have data on all of these other sealings where Joseph Smith is being very concerned about these things and saying, if you don't want to marry me, that's okay, right? And so when we look at this potential 1 disputed case in the context of every other marriage, it would go against the trend and against the data to prioritize the potential date where he was on a mission, right? Is the argument that's being made right now.
Yeah, and again, it's one of those things where I'm more inclined to take Miranda's word for it when he says that this happened after Orson had come back.
Yes.
And so it's one of those things where I struggle with sometimes. I struggle again with how these critics are representing this as having often occurred, and Joseph again being deliberately deceptive. And I just don't think the data bear out on that.
Also, it's interesting to know where this claim comes from originally. Do we know who the first person who made this claim was?
John C. Bennett.
A John C. Bennett, who upheld historically as a shining example of honesty and never contradicting himself, right? Or going back.
One thing that I learned maybe a year ago that really, really bugs me is that he was one of the very first advocates in the United States to have people eat tomatoes, because people people actually thought tomatoes were toxic, and so
had no one tried one?
Well, it's a little complicated.
Okay,
sorry, but he was one of the primary advocates for people eating tomatoes, and so the reason I have to pull a tomato off of my burger because they're disgusting is because of John C. Bennett, and that is one of the. It's just a trivia thing. It's also
no, this is important.
Yeah,
it's historical data.
Well,
this makes me have a lower opinion of John Bennett.
Pretty low. Quite a bit about his character in my head.
To your point, though, about John Bennett being the epitome of honesty, I want to say it was Garrett Dirkmott.
Yes.
Did a really good job of being able to explore some of the claims that were made by John C. Bennett. He wrote a paper on the happiness letter, basically arguing that it primarily originated from John C. Bennett.
We don't have the original.
We don't have the original
copy from
and we have a copy from John C. Bennett. And we have multiple people saying that that Joseph Smith didn't write the happiness letter. So there's that. It's a little bit, that is a little bit more nuanced. But we absolutely have records of John C. Bennett lying, basically.
His entire narrative flips completely depending on who he's talking to.
Yes.
Right.
And for one instance, he's basically, in one instance, he would deny any wrongdoing. He was excommunicated from the church for tricking women into sleeping with him. Despite the fact Joseph would give him multiple chances, he tried to reconcile himself. Eventually, enough was enough. John C. Bennett was excommunicated. And
at some points, he's going to say, oh, I never did any of that. I was completely innocent. It's all Joseph, right, who's a terrible person here. And then he's going to also admit, no, okay, I was guilty. You know what? I was sleeping with
He had an affair with the princess of Nauvoo. This is how he wrote this. This is how he makes a reference to that.
You're telling me that when John Bennett makes reference to Joe Smith's cloistered, chambered, and Cyprian maids, he's not telling the truth?
Oh, I can go further beyond that. So here's a quote of from a really good book on polygamy called House Full of Females by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich.
Fantastic.
It's a really, really good book. But they make reference to John C. Bennett. And so I'm gonna make a quick one. You might have to edit this for YouTube, but you'll see here why. So Bennett was touring the nation with a lurid book-length expose charging Mormon leaders with infidelity, theism, atheism, lying, deception. There's no comment between lying, deception, by the way. It's lying, deception. It's one term.
Oh.
Blasphemy, debauchery, lasciviousness, madness, fraud, plunder, larceny, burglary, robbery, perjury, adultery, arson, treason, and murder. He said Smith and his followers out-Heroded Herod, out-deviled the devil, slandered God Almighty, Jesus Christ, and the holy angels, and even the devil himself.
And while later he admits, no, I actually was guilty.
So it's one of those things where I would never take something John C. Bennett says at face value unless I could corroborate some details with some better historical sources.
Possibly the only thing he was correct about, unfortunately, is that tomatoes are in fact not toxic.
Rabbits.
But yeah, anyway, so it's like this claim that Joseph Smith was marrying women while their husbands were out on missions comes from possibly the worst source in the history of primary sources. Right? Like, there is nobody more contradictory that you can possibly pull this from.
Well, they would actually say, so I against my better judgment, I watched the Mormon Stories episode, and they talked about the fact that we apologists don't like referencing John C. Bennett. And they said, well, we just don't like referencing John C. Bennett because he's telling the truth, just like Oliver Cowdery was telling the truth when he accused Joseph Smith of adultery, and just like William Law, the Nauvoo expositor, was, telling the truth. So,
right.
We'll talk a little bit about the Nauvoo.
No, we can admit he was right about tomatoes, and that's all I can see. That's it. So,
I wouldn't trust John C. Bennett as far as I could throw him.
Yeah. No, and this, to be fair to John C. Bennett, this claim does get made by other people as well. 15 Years Among the Mormons, a book by Nelson Winch Green, he's talking about what an estranged member, Mary Eddy V. Corey, told him, right? And he's going to argue that William Law, Robert D. Foster, and Henry Jacobs were all sent on missions so that he could steal their wives. But Law and Foster, as far as the data indicate,
that's just not true.
Yeah, Green is going off of the one account from one estranged member, but we have zero data to indicate that Law or Foster ever served missions, and we do have the sealing dates for Jacob's wife, right? Jacobs wasn't on a mission when Joseph proposed a sealing to his wife.
We can talk a little bit about William Law, too, because they spend a lot of time talking about
the Nauvoo expositor. Do we want to jump to that?
Let's jump to the Nauvoo expositor.
Okay. I think the next thing up chronologically here is the happiness letter. And then we're going to have Joseph Smith declare
while you're looking that
a Nauvoo expositor.
So very briefly, I don't want to spend too much time on the Council of 50. I feel like that would warrant more time than we have. They make some incorrect claims in the sense that they say that this is 50 of Joseph's closest followers.
It's not.
It's not. Like, we actually know for a fact that there are non-members on that council, specifically because Joseph Smith is primarily valuing this idea of, like, differences in religion and like, religious freedom and that sort of thing. And so it's odd to me. It's odd to me that they make that claim. When he's promoted king, it's not him promoting himself. They're good about mentioning that it's not him doing it himself. His followers anoint him prophet, priest, and king. And if that's a familiar term in archaeology, that's because it is. Because if you go to the temple, they talk about being anointed kings and priests and that sort of thing. And so we're very, very open about that sort of thing. And again, as you read the minutes for the Council of 50, Joseph Smith is talking about openly disagreeing with each other and like being able to arrive at truth. We get some really great notes, again, thanks to Garrett Dirkmuth. His Standard of Truth podcast, by the way, top notch. I really like it. Yes, they talk about like how we're supposed to be disagreeing with each other and we're supposed to be trying to get to the bottom of the thing, and we just have to disagree long enough to get to the truth and the best way to proceed. And I mean, if you look at a lot of this stuff together, this isn't Joseph Smith losing his marbles. This is Joseph Smith trying to find a way to have this people prepare the way for God to come back. And any reference to Joseph Smith being made a king is usually exaggerated by critics.
Listen to exactly what they claim of the Council of 50.
Sure. Well,
50 of his apostles.
They were called the Council of 50. It was a secret little group of his closest male advisors. And they anointed him prophet, priest, and king. And it was in the context of a theocracy, basically.
Right, so closest male advisors is what they're claiming, right? Just like the apostles and his closest friends, which is just completely untrue, right? We have his direct political and theological adversaries, right? People from other religions who are mutually interested in the idea of bringing to pass the millennium, right, is what's going on here. They're preparing the world for Jesus's millennial reign. And yes, as you say, this phrase is very common.
Yeah, and it's there was one more thing I wanted to point out.
On the claim that he made himself king?
Yes.
It's kind of contradicting with Jesus.
Yeah, and I would also he also makes a comment here about faithful historians basically saying that Joseph Smith around the Nauvoo time lost his marbles. Source? Because I said so? Okay. Again, they just throw these things out and they don't go into it. They throw these kind of vague generalities. I would love for them to be able to mention where they're getting this information from so that we can actually talk about it.
If you actually read the accounts of the Council of 50, it gives you the impression that Joseph just kind of lost his marbles.
If you read, according to Dehlin, reading the minutes of the Council of 50 gives you the impression that Joseph just kind of lost his marbles. He's running he's being chased by the law. He's running out of time. He has all these wives. Emma's mad at him, right? And so Dehlin is saying, oh, he lost his marbles. There was just too much going on. One, understandable in that context. I would lose my marbles much before that point. Probably around wife number 2, you know. But so to be fair to Joseph Smith, understandable. But yeah, this seems like an unfair assertion. Joseph Smith is very cognizant, right, and very clear about what he's doing in 1844. This is where we get some of his best work, in my opinion. But
oh yeah, I mean, 1844 is where we get the King Follett sermon, which again is made reference to in the Nauvoo Expositor.
Mm-hmm.
You can go ahead and start looking for that. But again, the Council of 50, it can often be a source of like questions people have, but at the end of the day, if you look at it closely, if you actually see what's going on, who's part of the council, what they're talking about in terms of religious freedom, in terms of how to actually counsel together. This isn't Joseph losing his marbles, bossing everybody around in some kind of kingly theocracy. That's primarily coming from dissidents of the church, those kinds of claims. And the Joseph Smith Papers makes that abundantly clear. That said, I can understand why people might have questions about it, but I dislike how these critics are representing the information because it is very clearly biased, it is very clearly misinformed, and it is very clearly designed to make Joseph look in the worst possible way, despite what the context would indicate.
Right, and I think the context would indicate that Nauvoo is, I would say the reverse, that Nauvoo is the time when Joseph Smith gets all the time to put forward all of his good ideas, like his anti-slavery position, his more clear-cut exposition of doctrine and revelations, and organizing a city and a society better than before, with people who are closer to him and more unified with him. And like we were talking about, advances with freedom of religion, making that super explicit in all the major documents.
Well, the problem is that they're starting this sort of thing, and Joseph Smith is running for the presidency because he's literally reaching out to all these different candidates, begging, pleading with them, please, would you redress what happened in Missouri when, our fair sons and daughters of the saints were brutally slaughtered in places like Hans Mill? Please, would you do something? And they're all like, oh, there's nothing I can do for you. And so the candidacy was primarily done just so that you could draw attention to the saints. Again, Carah Duckman. And so it's one of those things where they try to paint Joseph in this predatory, politically power-motivated con man. And as you look at it more closely, something very, very different is going on.
Yeah, Garrett Dirkmont, Derek Sainsbury, Matthew McBride, fantastic sources on the political campaign.
Yeah.
Let's see, what was Eve taught about why Joseph Smith went to Carthage jail?
What were you taught growing up in the MTC about why Joseph Smith went to Carthage jail and ultimately died? All the people that put him in jail and ended up killing him, what was their reason for putting him in jail and killing him? What were you taught? What did you teach others about the fact that he was put in jail and ultimately killed?
I mean, that wasn't part of the curriculum before someone got baptized.
Oh.
At least I don't think we...
It was for Jesus, right? I mean, we all know why Jesus was killed, right?
Yeah.
Why not Joseph?
I mean, every movie...
Actually, you look like you need to stop on that.
No, you can't do that, John. You cannot sit here and pretend that the theological implications for Jesus Christ's death is the same for Joseph Smith's death. That is objectively wrong by every stretch of the margin.
That's a pretty hilarious comparison. And the retort to that is going to be, well, Joseph compared himself to Jesus. But again, this is kind of ridiculous, right? One of these has much more theological significance than the other.
Do you really want to sit here and tell me that Joseph Smith's death, I mean, obviously, Joseph Smith was he was a prophet of God. He was, of course, sincere. We believe him to have been called by God to usher in the restoration. But Jesus Christ died so that all of us can return back to God. What Joseph Smith does doesn't matter if what Jesus didn't happen.
And so Joseph Smith's death is unnecessary, right? Jesus' death is necessary.
And there's a reason that we talk about Jesus Christ in just about every single lesson that we have as a missionary, because Jesus Christ is at the forefront of everything that we do. You cannot pretend for a moment that we value Joseph Smith more than we value Jesus Christ. And the mere suggestion here is
comparable.
Yeah, that they're comparable, and and the suggestion here that because they're comparable, therefore the church is hiding it, is not only a non sequitur, but it's also blatantly offensive to anybody who understands the significance of what Jesus Christ's sacrifice does. I'm sorry, that got a little...
No, we had to stop on that. That was worth... Yeah.
I watched everything I can recall, just painted those people who were coming after him as just people who were persecuting the church and didn't like Mormons, and
it's like, we're gonna get Brother Joe, right?
Yeah, really scary. And some people just liked persecuting other religions. I think that's what was in my mind.
The extermination order.
Yeah.
That? I always grew up with that same, kind of a persecution complex, that people are just out to get us because we're part of the true church, and they killed Joseph because he was preaching God's true word, and of course that's going to be hated by sinful mankind.
Hey, Carah, why was the Missouri persecution brought about? It was an issue over slavery. You see, again, Standard of Truth podcast for the win.
So good, dude.
Missouri had recently become a state because of a compromise that was done. I want to say Maine was accepted as a free state, and Missouri was accepted as a slave state. It's kind of like a compromise of adding additional states. But Missouri didn't want anybody who was a free slave or abolitionist stuff being brought into the country because, surprisingly enough, when you start having that kind of dialogue being brought about among slaves start to ask questions as to why they're being enslaved. So you have that. They're living in Missouri at the time. The Saints are living in Missouri at the time. They're primarily Northerners. I'm not saying that all Latter-day Saints are, staunch abolitionists. I don't think that's what Gerhard Dorkmont says either. But what I am saying is that there was an article that was written by, I want to say it was W.W. Phelps, who basically was explaining to Black Latter-day Saints who were trying to gather in Missouri, the land of Zion. Double check me on that, Noah. But they basically saying something to the tune of, let prudence guide, in the sense that there are some laws here talking about whether or not freed slaves can live here and whether or not Missouri can basically re-enslave you again and send you back to slavery.
Mm-hmm. And Phelps, 1833, in the Evening and Morning Star, his article, Free People of Color, very explicitly, we have no special rule in the church as to people of color. That's very explicitly right. We are totally okay with it, despite the fact that we are living in Missouri, a slave state.
Right. And so Missourians didn't like having Phelps directly say, hey, this is how you come into the country. Really? Or, sorry, the state, I should say. But yeah.
So, yeah.
Because, again, Missouri is priding itself on this idea of it very specifically being a slave state, and then also trying to avoid having abolitionist literature being propagated in or having free slaves enter in, because when enslaved slaves see freed slaves, they don't really like that very much. And so there was a whole thing where this mob was basically saying, we can't let these Latter-day Saints do this. And in the same manner that the founding fathers went against what was legal to try to kind of usher in this greater good, we are going to go against what is legal to usher in this greater good to prevent these slaves from basically having this kind of information and prevent the Latter-day Saints from being able to propagate this kind of information.
Slavery is the big conflict.
Slavery is the big conflict.
There's absolutely also some economic concerns, right? Suddenly there's this huge population of Mormons moving in, very tight-knit insular community. There's absolutely some political tensions because their political influence is growing, right, on this issue of slavery, right? Just general cultural differences here. And there is absolutely a lot of religious justifications being thrown out, right? Like, oh, the Book of Mormon, and they believe they're the one true church, I assume, arguments like that. But polygamy is not a question in Missouri.
That's correct.
Right? It's not a question. It's nowhere on this is when they are being attacked in Missouri, Huntsville Massacre, all of this, polygamy is nowhere on their radar.
You don't really see public criticism about polygamy until the Nauvoo Expositor.
Yeah. Exactly.
And again, to try and paint this, and I've talked to critics of the church who tried to paint the Missouri persecutions as being relevant to polygamy, and it's just there's no good information to support that. Let's jump into the Nauvoo Expositor, because that's probably one of the last.
Jump into the Nauvoo Expositor. But yes, Carah, if you want to say that, the church had a persecution complex, you need to acknowledge that they were being persecuted because they had no special rule in the church as to people of color, right? That's where the persecution is coming from, not polygamy originally. Nauvoo Expositor, as we're going to see, gets a little more complicated.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, well, and I think that whole story starts when they tell you about Joseph when he was young, and he would go and tell people that he saw God the Father and Jesus Christ, and that people would just think he was crazy, and that's kind of where that persecution started, and it just...
Right on, yeah.
Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, so the true story behind basically what happened is between the number 13 and then that we're on right now, and number 14 that we're going to get into, they're both kind of connected, is just the idea that Joseph had amassed just so much financial troubles and polygamy, and he was marrying so many underage women and participating in so many illegal practices that his first presidency member, William Law was his name.
So imagine like Henry Eyring or Dallin H. Oakes, like in the first presidency, right? William Law was in the first presidency. Okay.
Yeah. Publicly disclosed that Joseph Smith's secret polygamy was being practiced all across Nauvoo, and he got together with some people and printed a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor and just basically outed Joseph Smith's polygamy and just...
Is polygamy illegal?
There were anti-bigamy laws in Illinois at the time. So the question at that point becomes, what does it mean to call somebody a plural wife? And so Joseph would probably argue that, well, we're not legally married under like state law. This is like a spiritual binding ceremony. And so the question at that point would be, do other people see it that way?
And how do they understand sealings in this context, right? Yeah, because we have some pretty good evidence that it's not always traditional marriage sealings, right? And there's a lot of other stuff going on there as well. There are some that absolutely look very much like traditional marriages, and other people understand them that way as well.
Yep. But they're talking about William Law.
Yes.
Right? So a resource I will point to, there are a couple of resources I would point to. There's a Church History Matters podcast episode on the Nauvoo Expositor. I see you have a sticker on your laptop for that. The problem with pointing out, the problem with dealing with the Nauvoo Expositor is that these two critics will go on to say that everything in the Nauvoo Expositor history is borne out to be true. So I have a couple of questions for these critics then regarding some of the claims made in the Nauvoo Expositor as to whether or not they're true or they are complete. Let me go ahead and pull this up. So they say that they have no personal beef with Joseph Smith. Robert Foster, one of the authors, of course, is on record, previous to this point, having pulled a gun on Joseph Smith.
Mild disagreement.
Yep, mild disagreement. And what does Joseph do in response? Does he send the Nauvoo Legion to kill? No, he just gives him a fight. So, but in conjunction with that, they call Joseph and Hiram bloodthirsty and murderous. I would love to see, history bearing out that being true. I'd be interested to see your sources on that. They also make a reference to Joseph's appeal to presidency so that he could further increase in political power and enforce religion upon believers. Again, we talked about the presidency already. There's really not really good evidence to support that.
He didn't even do that in Nauvoo. And there was a little bit of religious diversity there, right?
There's two separate things here. Is Council of 50 theocracy, right? But then also presidential campaign, right? And one of those is absolutely not trying to enforce religious beliefs on people.
But let's talk about William Law for a minute.
Yeah.
William Law was a member of the first presidency, as they accurately point out, and he was pretty stalwart for a good long while. But there are a couple of things that cause problems. So William Law ends up getting really sick, and he confesses to either Hiram or Joseph on his deathbed, saying that he cheated on his wife. William Law gets better, but when William Law, I want to say that the discussion comes up as to whether or not William Law can be sealed to his wife, and in conjunction with that, Joseph says no. And it's implied that it's because William Law had cheated on his wife. And there were, of course, some harsh feelings on that. Depending on whose perspective you listen to, there's some conflict as to what happens next. The Laws would claim that Joseph Smith approached William Law's wife and asked to be plurally sealed, and then she was just so mortified at that prospect that they decided to both step away. Joseph would claim that in light of the sealing being denied between William Law and his wife, William Law's wife goes to Joseph, says, "Please, can I be plurally sealed to you?" Joseph says no, and she gets upset. And so the Laws claim something fundamentally different than what Joseph Smith claims. But there's absolutely some context that needs to be addressed here that isn't fully addressed by these critics, because they don't mention the idea that William Law was confessed to cheating on his wife, and they don't really deal with the idea that Robert Foster pulled a gun on Joseph Smith. They are representing everything going on here as being these good and noble people just being whistleblowers and truth seekers, when really, as we dig deeper down into what's going on here, there's absolutely some personal beef, and to say that there's not is to go directly against the information we.
Good stuff on William Law. Okay. And
We can post. My friend Sarah Allen has a really good kind of brief overview about William Law and kind of his the rise and fall of William Law. We can post that in the.
She's done some fantastic work. That will be in the description.
So in the Constitution, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press. Like William Law, first presidency, Joseph's been denying polygamy for all those years, like we told you, practicing it but denying it. William Law finds out, first presidency member, says you're lying and this is not of God, purchases a printing press, publishes one edition of the Nauvoo Expositor. Joseph, as mayor, has his henchmen destroy the printing press and all the copies of the Nauvoo Expositor, violating the U.S. Constitution and the Nauvoo Charter's own adoption of the U.S. Constitution, violating the freedom of press. That's why he was put in prison.
There's a lot of complex arguments being made over whether or not destroying the printing press was a violation of the Constitution. They're very technical and get into the law at the time and how it was understood, right, which is how the Constitution is meant to be interpreted, right, in the context. And I don't know if we want to get really deep into those.
John Taylor quotes the charter as saying to declare what shall be a nuisance and prevent and remove the same. So that seems to go against what Dehlin is saying.
So that's true.
Yeah.
Dehlin H. Oakes in the 60s wrote an article basically saying something to that, where the best justification is basically appealing to the charter. One of the things I will also point out, though, is that Joseph Smith appeals to a couple of different instances, a couple of different cases wherein similar presses were destroyed.
Yes.
And they were overtly justified in doing that. They were basically let off the hook. There was no...
that is their appeal. It is jurisprudential, right, is the word here. That they are looking at previous instances of where this happened and using those to interpret the Constitution and what freedom of speech means in these circumstances where there is something that is they interpret to be libelous being published, right? So this is jurisprudence here. The judges have the authority to decide, based on previous cases, how the law is actually applied in these circumstances.
Yeah, and so there are some complicated arguments. There are some really good papers. There are some really good papers that we can cite in the description, but the we don't have to hound that too deeply. They're really good resources, and at the end of the day, just basically saying that they're illegally doing this is far more simplistic than I think is warranted.
It's really annoying. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Nauvoo printing press gets destroyed under the argument that it's a public nuisance. And the next argument being made is sex trafficking in the early Mormon church.
I got this.
Okay.
But the problem is that everything that was printed in the Nauvoo Expositor has been shown by history to be true. So they weren't printing lies. Joseph wanted to spin it as printing lies, but history has borne out that everything William Law printed, including trafficking. So one of the most disturbing things...
Sex trafficking?
Yeah. If you read the Nauvoo Expositor, what they would do is they would send missionaries to Europe, and they would look for the super poor, young, teenage women. And they would say, hey, there's a prophet back in the United States. He's a prophet of God. He's got a new book. And these young women would show up in Nauvoo, not even able to speak English. And literally, like Joseph Smith and other apostles and general authorities would kind of like go, I think she's hot. I think she's hot. I want her. I want her. And these women were literally, by missionaries, trafficked from Europe to Nauvoo to be taken as plural wives of the general authorities.
Okay, I have two questions.
Expositor. Do we want to let you ask questions, or do you have an immediate response, and then we're going to get to her concerns?
So we'll let me throw a couple things out here just first.
Okay.
So there's some context here, because prior to this point, John Dehlin was on with a few other critics. Some of them you guys are probably familiar with. Samantha Shelley with Zelf on the Shelf, Nemo the Mormon, and Julia with Analyzing Mormonism.
Yes.
So again, people who are pretty unified in their dislike for what the church has done in the past. But they say that newspapers in England are reporting this idea of like alleged bad things that are happening in the Americas, well, like when they're going over. Right. So, a couple problems. One, these newspapers are primarily being printed during the Utah period. Okay. And so being able to extrapolate Utah polygamy and to say that because we have ideas about Utah polygamy, this must be how Nauvoo polygamy is being practiced. Significant problems there. We've already talked about some of that. They also make a reference to Heber C. Kimball, basically saying something to the effect of, we're concerned about like the missionaries taking all the best wives for themselves, save some for us kind of a thing. So
clearly
follow the sources. Yeah. If you follow the sources, it's actually hearsay. And so they cite it cites back to like an article in the New York Times, and they say, our private correspondents are giving us this information. Yeah. And yet we don't really have any corroborating evidence for that. They're basing it off of hearsay.
The New York Times, which famously in the 20th and 19th century was just as charitable to the Mormon Church as the Salt Lake Tribune has historically been, which is incredible.
So when Dehlin says that the women here don't speak English and are being trafficked, he's doing so because Samantha, that's off on the shelf, mentioned an article by an English journalist who allegedly visited Utah, and they're trying to tie that back to Joseph Smith.
Right.
The description from this journalist is likewise really bad. We're talking, just for context, they're saying these women are, brought in and they're basically supposed to sleep on the floor, and there are men guarding with guns standing around them so none of them can escape.
This is like those classic stereotypical like cartoons of like the bed with 50 women in it, these.
Okay, you better put that picture up if you're going to make it.
Oh yeah, it's fantastic. These anti-polygamy cartoons that are circulating in the 20th century, late 19th century, just hilarious, right? The yellow journalism at the time that's going on, right? And very objective historians are going to say, yeah, this is kind of ridiculous how far they go to paint this as just.
And yet there is no pushback from these critics as to the credibility of this kind of source. The problem here is that John takes this a step further. Instead of saying that this is directly coming from a newspaper, we have the Nauvoo expositor being directly referenced as being this kind of way for people to be trafficked, despite the fact that they kind of try to have their cake and eat it too. Because on one hand, they want to reference the Nauvoo expositor's claim of like foreign women in foreign areas.
Mm-hmm.
But they also, in the same breath, try to say that that's not actually necessarily applying to foreign women per se. It's actually referencing Louisa Beeman and Martha Brotherton.
Okay.
And so Louisa Beeman, we don't have to go too deeply into her. Don Bradley's done some really good work explaining kind of the timing of this and basically explaining that this is how Louisa's family was involved. It wasn't some kind of trafficking nefarious thing. Like everyone in the house was involved. They knew about it.
Right.
Louisa herself directly says that she consented to the marriage, and so being able to saying that, this is something against her will again is directly wrong. She's also 27 at the time. So are we going to say that she doesn't have the mental and emotional capacity to consent to this kind of marriage? Again, I have a really hard time getting behind that. Martha Brotherton is a little bit interesting. So if you want to say she's foreign, she's technically from England, according to John C. Bennett. And John C. Bennett is, again, one of the people propagating the story.
Right.
So the argument that they make is Martha Brotherton claimed that Joseph Smith locked her in a room with Brigham Young, so Brigham Young could convince her, so to speak, to be plurally sealed to her. Jeez. This is, of course, refuted by Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, President Kimball, and even Martha's brother-in-law.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so there are some very, very strong reasons to kind of challenge this narrative that's being presented here by these critics. So this could very well turn into a he said, she said argument, but it should give us pause if we have in one corner John C. Bennett and Martha Brotherton, and in the other corner 4 people who all know Martha Brotherton really well, including Martha's brother-in-law. It's one of those things where they would have to basically say, I'm choosing this source because X, Y, and Z things. I would want them to explain why we should take Martha Brotherton's explanation of the story over what these other people are saying.
And this is one of those things that, as Stephen Harper points out, is going to come entirely down to your presuppositions and the assumptions that you have coming into these sources, whether or not you trust Joseph Smith, right, and think that he's honest, or if you don't, right? And as I've repeatedly pointed out, the historical record and the consensus of non-LDS academics is increasingly in favor of the fact that Joseph Smith was religiously sincere, that he genuinely believed he was called of God, right? And if we look at these other cases of polygamy, he is repeatedly asking the families for consent, asking the families for permission, sometimes being approached by the families, right? But working with them, there are no repercussions for wives who refuse to marry him. So if we suddenly have one conflicting story where someone's saying she's being locked in a room, but we have 4 pieces of evidence against that, plus this entire general narrative that historians are starting to agree on and is really emerging as a consensus, that's why we would say we wouldn't lean towards it, trusting.
But here's the problem. So the problem is that play her question now. As I remember what her question is.
And that is actually true.
Questions.
And that's in the Nauvoo Expositor, and that is actually true.
I have 2 questions. I know you were just reading from, obviously, this back and forth between the governor and Joseph Smith. But where are you reading that from? Like,
Good question. So, No Man Knows My History, page 389.
okay, and this is the book by David O. McKay's niece, who was excommunicated, and she got all this stuff from the church history.
And from like going to the state of Illinois and looking
getting
up
that
the
stuff.
records of Thomas Ford. And
And the stuff you're talking about with sex trafficking was
That
from
was-
the Nauvoo Expositor.
we have the actual text of the one edition of the Nauvoo Expositor. You can just type Nauvoo Expositor and read everything that was printed on it.
But if what Joseph is saying
that it's
is
just
true,
The Nauvoo Expositor talks about foreign women, but it doesn't provide any examples. And the best the best possible things that they could try and tie to any plural marriages that Joseph Smith is involved in are Louisa Beaman and Martha Brotherton. Again, that's both of those are highly suspect, especially by virtue of the fact that they're pulling from kind of secondhand critical sources to try and make those connections anyway.
Right.
And so there's a little bit more. We'll get to that next part because she's going to ask, where are you getting more information about this kind of sex trafficking thing?
But for Dehlin to assert that everything that the Nauvoo Expositor asserted has borne out to be true, a honest historian is going to say, at best, it's highly contested. Right.
that it's just all lies, but you're saying history has played out that it's not lies.
That William Law told the truth.
Where's the source of the history that that is corroborating the Nauvoo Expositor?
Eve's smart, man. She's like an attorney. She's
my dad
I
is
love
a
this.
lawyer.
That's great. That's awesome.
So
Yeah. No.
I'm just trying
You'd
to
have to read
figure
In
out.
Sacred Loneliness. You'd have to read the Journal Discourses. You'd have to read History of the Church, statements made by the brethren. You could read the sources that No Man Knows My History would draw from. So that's the thing. You can read No Man Knows My History, and there's a gazillion footnotes.
You could go.
So he makes a claim that you can learn about the sex trafficking stuff from Journal Discourses, In Sacred Loneliness, History of the Church, statements made by the brethren, and the footnotes in No Man Knows My History. So massive problems there. I, again, would want them to provide the sources, page numbers, right, and that sort of thing.
Let's go find a massive bucket list of sources, and saying, oh, there's footnotes over there somewhere. Yeah. I was like, I know that they're doing this extemporaneously. Obviously, unlike us, they don't have computers up in front of them, right, where they're actually able to go and check all of these things. But yeah, we would like to see those sources, please.
Right. And this, of course, is a repost, something that they did 2 years ago.
Right.
If John really wanted, he could have put notes up there, but he didn't.
He didn't. There's no notes attached to this 2 years on. Right.
So there's that. I would argue that not a single one of those documents support the idea that Joseph Smith is actually trafficking these women. And I encourage them to use primary, contemporary, corroborated sources to demonstrate this kind of level of accusation. Because this is serious stuff. Obviously, she's really bothered by this.
Yeah.
I would expect better than just hand-waving, I'll just go read no.
It's here, and it's here, and it's here, and it's here. It's all over. You can find it anywhere.
And then also,
rhetorical point that they're making.
they also claim that it comes from a strong rolling.
Oh, really?
So keep playing.
Oh,
just a
wow.
second.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you could go, and it'll tell you what the sources are for all her assertions. Same with Rough Stone Rolling. Rough Stone Rolling will also tell the story of the Nauvoo expositor, and it will have footnotes where you can go and read the original sources. So we're not asking you to believe us.
No, I know you are.
But yeah, they do make this claim. I noticed this a few times where they throw out a whole bunch of claims. They did the same thing with polygamy, right? They're like, oh, Joseph Smith did this and this and this and this and this and this. And then they'll say, oh, you can read all about this in Rough Stone Rolling. And Rough Stone Rolling maybe corroborates one or two of those claims and disagrees heavily with the interpretation of those claims that they're presenting, right? Which is this really ironic thing that you get a lot in LDS history, where like a good amount of the historians publishing this stuff that they're referring to, the Gospel Topics essays, right, Rough Stone Rolling, are faithful active members who know the sources at least as well, if not better, than the critics, right? Again, if you take the top 50 Joseph Smith historians, I would wager that if not at least half, a solid percentage of them are faithful active members, right? So to present this narrative where like, oh, the church is hiding all this stuff from you, and as soon as you learn about it, you're going to lose your testimony, is just kind of ridiculous. And I think John knows this because he's had guests on his podcast who are very informed, right? He's had Patrick Mason on his podcast.
They make a reference to the Patrick Mason interview in this.
Oh, yeah?
They basically say that they pull from a quote. I haven't seen the Patrick Mason.
Oh, yeah. Listen to
But
this.
They're doing this like 30 years.
Oh, yeah,
There's
I know.
no credible, faithful Mormon historian that would question pretty much anything I just told you.
Okay.
Holy cow. Are you kidding me? What?
We've been doing nothing but citing LDS historians who do nothing but question what you're saying.
Oh, man. Yeah, and a lot of this is just like they're citing outdated scholarship all over the place. They're citing Fawn Brody's biography as the epitome, right, of objective scholarship.
We're coming up on, let's see, it was done 1940s, so we're coming up on over 80 years.
It's just straight up dishonest at this point, isn't it?
Yeah, this is kind of ridiculous, right? To be like, oh, yeah, all the faithful historians agree with everything that we say. The credible ones, at least, to throw a bit of well poisoning in.
Right. Because anyone who disagrees wouldn't be credible.
Right. This is insane. But yeah, no, so we can list quite a few historians right here and now who are absolutely going to question not just the overarching narrative and interpretation that they're proposing here, but the specific sources, right?
So, No Man Knows My History. I want to say in this interview, they say that No Man Knows My History is the best biography written on Joseph Smith.
The best Freudian psychobiography and psychoanalysis.
So, I have a couple of thoughts on that. So they tried to actually corroborate this with something I hadn't thought about before. They tried to say that Richard Bushman cites No Man Knows My History more than he cites other books. I want to say it's the most cited book. That's the claim that they make.
Sure.
I would have to look in that. But you want to know why that is? But that's actually a far less impressive claim than you say. Because if you want to compare the number of footnotes in No Man Knows My History to the number of footnotes in Rough Stone Rolling, there's not a contest there. Rough Stone Rolling, by and large, has the most up-to-date information. It has far, far more sources encompassing far more comprehensively both positive and negative sources than No Man Knows My History. And don't get me started on Fawn Brody's, again, psychoanalysis, or do we want to talk about her theory about Joseph Smith subconsciously hypnotizing the witnesses so that they can have those kinds of spiritual experiences? Because that's where that claim comes from. Would you say that the historical record has borne that to be true, John?
Yeah, let's talk just real quick about this. Some of the problems with No Man Knows My History, right? So this is the No Man Knows My History, to give it credit where credit's due, is the first serious, rigorous biography that we get after George Q. Cannon's basically hagiography, right? Hagiography.
Which is the opposite of what hagiography, for those who don't know, is a biography that's primarily focused on all the good things.
Hagiography is like an obituary, right? Where it's like, oh, he did all this amazing stuff, and we get a lot of like Catholic saints always have these beautiful hagiographies, for example. But Fawn Brody, ex-Mormon, trained at the University of Chicago. She's a professor at UCLA, right? One of the first female professors ever there. So hers is much more historically rigorous than anything else at the time. But the joke that we've been making a few times here is that she relies very heavily on Freudian psychobiography, trying to explain Joseph Smith through this Freudian lens. And there's a lot of jokes we could make about Sigmund Freud, right? But the point here is that this approach that von Brody takes and relies on is now viewed with quite a bit of skepticism. Is that fair to say? By most historians, because Freudian psychobiography, this entire field, relied very heavily on like heavy speculation about someone's inner life, right? And their motives and everything without direct evidence at the time. And in 1948, as we've pointed out, von Brody just didn't have access to a lot of primary sources. Like pre-internet era, access to all of these original documents from Joseph Smith is limited. It's controlled. This is the standard for 20th century historical archives, right?
To be fair, though, she was allowed into the vaults where we have a lot of this sort of thing.
Yes.
And she did so. She was able to leverage her relationship with David O'Mackey. Yes, David O'Mackey's niece. She was able to get it. They didn't know what book she was trying to write. I think there would have been a little bit more pushback if they knew what she was trying to do. But, I mean...
They don't have it nearly as well cataloged and organized and systematized and methodologically done as the Joseph Smith papers have done, right? And so there's no way to fact check a lot of what she's saying because people don't have access to go in and fact check her.
I want to say she's one of the people that like tries to argue that like Views to Hebrews was used to write the Book of Mormon,
which immediately discredits her in my book. But I do want to give it the respect it deserves, right? It was landmark at the time, right, for Brody's attempt to use rigorous scholarly methods had not been done before. But there is pretty wide agreement amongst university-level historians today that its methodology, this attempt to use Freudian psychobiography, is outdated. And nobody nowadays should be referring to it as an authority unless you're like interested in the history of biographies about Joseph Smith, right?
And some of the claims it makes to refute them or change them.
Yeah, and another point, people often try and set up this contrast between von Brody and Richard Bushman, right? As like, oh, here's the anti and here's the faithful. We have quite a few more.
Well, actually, that's not what they say. If you read if they say
true.
In this video, what they say is they call Rough-Stone Rolling a warmed over no man knows my history.
Yeah, they say Rough-Stone Rolling is just anti-Mormon. Yeah.
Well, they want to say that it leads people out of the church, but it's.
Despite having Bushman on record as saying, I believe pretty much everything I believed when I was a missionary.
Here's my deal about that. It's not information per se that leads people out of the church. It's emotions about the information.
It's presuppositions and assumptions, and it's the way that the information is presented and interpreted. It's not raw data, right? And we can prove this very simply with pointing out that there is no logical contradiction between someone, for example, being a prophet and also being a polygamist, right? So you cannot say that data leads people out of the church, right? That is logically incoherent, right? To a certain.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things where I've thought about this because obviously I've gone on the internet quite a few times and posted content, and I try to be very fair in how I analyze things, but I also don't want to do anything that's going to cause somebody to feel cognitive dissonance in relationships to how they feel about the church. And so, I think I could do good. Well, I have more nuanced views on cognitive dissonance, but I know that a lot of people don't, and so.
Right.
I want to be fair to them and kind of meet them where they're at. But at the same time, I acknowledge the fact that some things I could say might just be very, very shocking to people. And I would never, while I may be careful in what I say, I also acknowledge the fact that even in my best efforts, I could accidentally lead somebody out of the church. And that wouldn't be anything that I'm doing per se. It would be how they are interpreting my information
based on their
presuppositions. And so trying to say that Rough-Stone Rolling is this catalyst for mountains of people to leave the church, as critics are wont to say, it causes a lot of problems because I don't think it fully understands why people leave the church, which is ironic because John Dehlin has written a study trying to understand why people leave the church. Wherein the same study, he also acknowledges that, there are some significant problems with sampling in the study. So there's acknowledged that.
Yes.
But to that point, I think that their appeal to No Man Knows My History is being better, but then also Rough-Stone Rolling basically being the same book. Corporate needs you to find the difference between these two pictures. They're the same picture. No, they're not. And so I just have a hard time getting behind that sort of thing.
Yeah. I wanted to really quickly point out, though, that we do have a lot more Joseph Smith biographies of high quality than some people want to paint, right? We have a pretty serious one-volume biography by Donna Hill in 1977, Joseph Smith, the First Mormon. It's much more moderate than von Brody's, right? Even though she's relatively progressive, right? She studied in New York. She has her master's in library science, incredibly well-read, right? Not directly trained in history, but super, super well-read, published a ton of books. Anyway, yeah, her biography of Joseph Smith is very moderate. We have one in 2003 from Robert Rimini, who was a historian of Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonian era at the University of Illinois of Chicago, right? So he does a short biography commissioned by Penguin Random House. It's very short. It's barely 160 pages, but it's also pretty moderate, right? It's not going to draw a lot of the conclusions that Fawn Brody draws. Rimini has been accused of slightly overemphasizing the influence of the Jacksonian era and Andrew Jackson's policies on Smith's actions and beliefs, right? He was very, very smart politically, but has been accused of maybe being a little more surface level when it comes to the religious stuff, right? But we have that. Obviously, we have Dan Vogel's biographies, right? And again, I point to these as an example of refuting the con man opportunist narrative in some aspects, right? He is going to be the first to start promoting this idea that Joseph Smith was, in many examples and instances, clearly religiously sincere, which is why you get, even if you go to like Dan Vogel's Wikipedia page, it notes that a lot of anti-Mormons they think that Dan Vogel is not harsh enough on Joseph Smith, right? Because he is the one who is really first getting to this at the start of the Joseph Smith Papers project back in 2004, 2005, right? Joseph Smith is demonstrably sincere, right? And finally, you get Refstone rolling in 2005. And we are now getting, in 2025, John Turner's biography, which is going to hammer this in, everything that we learned over the past 20 years. I'm very excited. We're going to be doing some content for sure. Talking about that because it is going to be fantastic. He's doing a panel discussion pretty soon here with some famous LDS historians, some non-members and some members. Matthew McBride, who I took a class from last semester, is going to be on that panel. He's fantastic.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So
they also say that John says that there's reasonable evidence that Joseph Smith sent Porter Rockwell to kill Governor Boggs. I don't like the overall point that they try to take with that, because Eve asks the question of, well, the Missourians were just trying to they were trying to kill the members of the church, so why can't the members defend themselves, kind of a thing. And John says something to the tune of, well, unless you're a follower of Jesus and Jesus says, bless them that persecute you and love your enemies, kind of a thing. And it bordered on the only way you can follow Christ is to
doormat passive.
There are better venues to explore that than here.
Yeah, we would need a philosopher in the room.
Yep. But it's one of those things that was just it felt like a little kind of surface level of, well, I don't want to have to deal with the fact that we don't have a lot of good evidence of Porter Rockwell. That he said it's reasonable, so someone could come to that conclusion. But John is also very careful to say, I'm not saying that's true, even though he'll say other things that he does believe is true that are wrong. But he doesn't want to make the accusation. He doesn't want to make the accusation that Joseph Smith actually did send Porter Rockwell, because he probably knows that there's not really great evidence to support it.
Right.
And John, if you're watching this, prove me wrong on that. If you would be willing to outline the evidence as to why you believe Porter Rockwell was sent by Joseph Smith to kill Governor Boggs, I would be very interested to hear your discussion on that. And more power to you for being willing to kind of explain why you believe that.
I think after that, one of the big points after talking about the reasons Joseph Smith died, one of the points they make is that the number one reason people leave the church is because members feel like they were lied to and betrayed, right? Which kind of John Dehlin that we looked over in some depth a while ago. You have spent a good long while looking at his methodologies.
Well, the thing is, it's helpful because I'm studying psychology right now, and John Dehlin's focus is psychology. And one of the primary reasons,
and psychologists ostensibly receive a lot of training in how to conduct studies.
I'd like to say so. I certainly haven't. I haven't graduated yet, but I can take a look at a study. I've taken quite a few statistics classes, both inside and outside of the psychology department, and so I would like to say that I understand the argument he's making. And first off, John doesn't want to mention this, but one of the statistically significant factors that they found as to why people leave the church is a desire to sin. It's not a very strong motivating factor, but it is a statistically significant factor, especially among people our age.
Yeah, enough people reported this as a reason that it is not like, oh, we can just say statistically significant in statistics terminology means that there are enough people reporting this, so we can't say, oh, it's a margin of error thing, right? It might be some people just kind of joking about it. There are enough people reporting that we have to take it seriously according to Dehlin's methodologies and the p-values and things that,
But as we were mentioning before, there are some significant issues with how John Dehlin is collecting his sample. He's primarily getting a lot of his information from cluster sampling in primarily former member environments. Cough, cough, the ex-Mormon subreddit.
Oh, he sends out a survey to r/ex-Mormon, right? And is like, hey, fill out your reasons here. And it's like, I wonder if the people who tend to frequent r/ex-Mormon might have skewed perspective on.
Well,
Not a random sample at all.
the thing is, it's difficult to get that sort of thing. Josh Coates also tried to do a sample that was very similar to that.
His was much more, though, postcards sent out, right? Yeah, that was much more.
And to be fair, I haven't looked at the link wherein he is like posting this to the ex-Mormon subreddit. I'm not entirely sure that such a link exists, but to put it bluntly,
that is his audience.
His audience. I should
Not specifically r/ex-Mormon, to make that clear.
Right. That is his. I want to be careful with how I explain.
Yes.
But
no, thank you for correcting.
But you're right in the sense that there is absolutely some potential for bias in how that's done. There are difficulties with just trying to get this information generally. For the same reasons that you might have problems for trying to figure out who's at fault in divorce. If you ask the husband and wife, for example, who's at fault for the divorce, they're going to point to the other person by and large, despite the fact that it's probably more complicated than that. The better exploration of this was Jana Reese's work.
Oh yeah, fantastic.
Talking about the New Mormons, I want to say is the name of the book.
Yes.
Talking about kind of millennials and Gen Z in the church. And they talk about, or ex-Mormons, I should say.
Next Mormons is the name of the book.
Next Mormons.
Yes.
I can talk. But the point is she actually makes the point that primarily people leave the church because of negative experiences that they have in the church.
Checks out.
And that makes more sense to me, admittedly. Just from a psychological perspective, because we are far more intuitive creatures. We value those kinds of experiences, and we value that sort of thing by and large more than we value kind of the rational justifications that we impose on those reasons.
We would all love to pretend that we are perfectly logical creatures, that we can sit here and talk about the data and the dates and the documents and everything, and that this is all that we can systematize this. But the fact of the matter is that psychologists are in complete agreement that we are absolutely not, right? That the intuitions come first, and how we feel about things comes first, and then data comes as a justification for those intuitions, right?
Yeah.
That is an overwhelming consensus, right? So this is consistent, Jana Reese's point, with Dehlin's argument that people leave the church because they feel betrayed or lied to, right?
Yeah.
That they had a negative experience.
But the question at that point becomes, why do they feel betrayed and hurt and lied to? And
It's not necessarily about transparency with church.
as we've talked about, but it could very well be that maybe they grew up in an environment where not a lot of this stuff was talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, certainly I think all of us would know people who have grown up in those kinds of environments. But, I mean, that's not necessarily the church's fault. For people growing up in that kind of environment, especially when we take into account this idea that a lot of this information has been made public, just a lot of people just don't know where, well, I guess in my mind, it's one of those things where what else should the church have done? Because if they're publishing this in historical books, and if they're publishing these things in Deseret Book, and they're publishing this in the Ensign, and they're publishing all this sort of thing, is the only way for critics to say that the church should be more transparent is it something that we should just be talking about every week in Sunday school? Yeah, like is that the only way we're saying that the church can be transparent?
I was actually just thinking about this a couple of days ago, and I think that's one way. But I think if you have that happen during Sunday school, religion kind of stops being religion and starts being an intellectual exercise. And let's learn about our history and make sure we have points of data to back up our beliefs, like you were saying. And I was thinking the only other way is also equally objectionable, because it would verge on the lines of like authoritarian, like you guys have to read these materials, be familiar with these materials, with, I don't know, some kind of repercussion. I can't figure out like you were saying, how would the church do better?
And I think that the critics' argument is that they simply want informed consent and that this information should be taught before baptism, right? Is their argument. And then our disagreement is simply that most of this is irrelevant and should not have an impact on your decision to stay in the church. And we can demonstrate this because we have and can point to plenty of faithful historians who are more than aware of all of these documents and narratives and arguments and sources and the decades and decades of scholarship being produced on it, and have decided to stay in the church, right? And the church's argument is always going to be that what should inform your decision to be baptized should be a spiritual witness, not innate familiarity with the sources, right? And that it would be unwise to prescribe and say that, oh, well, if someone doesn't know all these sources, they're just not rational, right? The argument I was making earlier, that if you're not super familiar with all of the data, you're not a rational person. You're not thinking rationally, right? Yeah.
Admittedly, we've probably gone a little longer than we probably were planning.
We was cut 90%.
Well, that's fair. The thing is, there's a lot more that can be said about a lot of these different topics. We obviously didn't cover every single comprehensive point that they mentioned in this video. But what I wanted to do, or one of the reasons that I was primarily interested in this, is because the reason Dehlin reposted this was because she wanted to be able to get another kind of context to the fact that he a few days later posted an interview that he did with Eve's parents,
who were faithful at the time when Eve did this interview.
And it's my understanding they're no longer members of the church.
Yep.
Oh, wow. In direct consequence to this kind of information, or I should say misinformation, being propagated by these critics. And
these narratives are demonstrably false. We can point to atheist, secular historians who would dispute many of the points and individual data points being brought up, but would dispute even more harshly the overall narratives being promoted. Right.
There's a part of me that's just really frustrated. You're watching this happen in real time, where this misinformation is actively harming faith and causing problems where there don't need to be problems. And as a direct result of this, somebody's life is going to be changed forever based on things that we can demonstrate are not true. And I just don't even have words.
It's an irrational argument, because what is the church supposed to do? Mandate that all investigators must read every volume of the Joseph Smith papers, all 26 or however many there are, before they're allowed to be baptized, right? It's a completely irrational argument. It makes no sense in the context of any religion ever, right? And the idea that the exact nature of all of these disputes about Joseph Smith's character should inform your decision to be baptized is just nonsensical. And we can point to this in the baptismal interview questions, right? Which mention Joseph Smith exactly once and only connect him to the idea that the church and the gospel have been restored through him. You don't have to say, in order to be a member, that you agree with anything that Joseph Smith did, right? That you agree, that you think he was even a good person, right? It's like, you don't. You can look at the Old Testament and all of these examples of the terrible prophets, and you don't have to actually believe that in order to be a member, right? This is my point.
No, yeah, I think that I agree.
So the argument that, there's not enough informed consent here is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, now I'm just sad.
And they're going to spend a good amount of time in this video talking about the fact that, the church has known these things for 100 years and they've been hiding it. And what do they think investigators should be told before they get baptized, right? How much the seer stones comes up a few more times, right? And they're talking so openly about these issues. And the problem here is, as they've pointed out, not the data, right? As we've pointed out, the data in themselves are not the issue. It's the fact that people feel lied and betrayed to. There have always been people within the church who, despite disagreeing strongly with some of the things that the institution might do, have been able to find community within the church, right? and find friends and like-minded people. We can point as far back as like Lowell Benyon, the famous classical liberal of the early 20th century, right? Who at every opportunity and at every point when he was given a pulpit to speak at, railed on the church, right? And he would have been a general authority if he hadn't so harshly been like, we are absolutely failing miserably in our divine commission to feed the poor and the needy, right? And to support the homeless, right? And look at these just like ridiculous, extravagant vacations that we're fundraising for. We're trying to get the youth trip out to Disney World while this poor lady is living in this broken down shack 2 wards from the chapel, right? Rails on the church, right? At every given opportunity. But he is able to find community. He's able to find like-minded people, right, who are sympathetic to him and his belief in his cause. And he doesn't feel like he's been lied to, right? Again, as we pointed out, this is much more emotional than it is logical, right, as all humans are. So if you're able to find these people, and that's what we're trying to do here, I think in large part with what we're doing at BYU, is find people who are struggling or are hurting, right, and give them a community. Because right now, the problem is that we have the people who are willing to talk about and want to talk about these issues in church history, their community is r/ex-Mormon, right? And there's absolutely a community of people within the church who are aware of these issues, but they're kind of hung up in academia, right? They're hung up over at the interpreter conferences and at the Journal of Mormon History, right? And at the popular level, there isn't quite as many people who are willing to talk about this stuff. That's the issue that we're seeing at the moment, is simply an issue of community building in the church around these issues.
And let me offer this as an invitation that if people are watching this and you do have questions, I would encourage you to reach out to somebody who you trust, who is informed about these topics and is willing to discuss them with you. And if you feel like you can't do that, reach out to me. Like, I don't know everything, but I'll talk with you about it, and we can figure this sort of thing out together. But don't feel like you have to go through this sort of information alone, and don't just take everything that you hear face value on the internet as being true, because as we've learned through sad experience, it's often not.
And we are more than happy also, despite not knowing everything, to put you in contact with these trained professional historians and experts who are publishing on this stuff all over the place. Some of them working here at BYU, right? Who you would not believe the amount of time that they spend talking to people who are struggling with their faith, right? Like, apparently that is just part of the job description. If you are a knowledgeable member, is you spend a ridiculous amount of time helping people through faith crises, right? That is so much of what they do. They are more than happy to do it. They are more than happy to reach out. They are more than happy to talk with you, right? And they're more than happy to offer their perspectives on how all of these issues in church history are not irreconcilable.
Okay.
Right.
Any parting shots? Quick.
No, that was very interesting to react to, and I'm glad we got to talk about it a lot.
Well, I'm glad that we got to talk about it too, and I'm sure that we'll find ways to collaborate again. But in the meantime,
we need to do an entire episode debunking John C. Bennett on tomatoes. His perspectives on tomatoes.
Please, actually, don't tempt me. In the meantime, though,
I want to look into the scholarship. I want to see, this man is definitely not a trained scientist. How is he thinking?
Well, that's actually part of the argument. So his argument is that he's Dr. Bennett, but he faked his credentials. That was the first in the line of many falsehoods in his life. And I'm getting that from Miles Harvey, King of Confidence. That's a
specific source.
That is a biography on James Strang, actually, because Bennett actually gets involved with the Strangite sect shortly after he's dismissed from Joseph's sect. Of course, John C. Bennett doesn't stick around for very long.
No, I wouldn't think so.
Tomatoes and Strangites. That's the podcasting right there.
We just dog on John Bennett.
I have some mixed feelings on it. It strikes me as being the no man knows my history equivalent. Oh, Joe Strang. Dang it. There's another biography I'm trying to get into. It was referenced on Church History Matters podcast. I'll put a link. I'll make sure to put a link to it in the description. Is it okay if we wrap up though, guys?
Yeah.
All right.
Do we have a good John C. Bennett biography? Do we have like a one-volume John C. Bennett biography? Is there one out there yet? Guys, I think this is our project. This is our calling. Jonathan Bennett needs a good, objective, non-psychobiographical biography.
I understand that. I probably wouldn't be able to write it. I don't know if I could keep my opinions to myself.
Oh man, it would be so fun. Look how many sources we have. Oh, wow. Look at all these sources. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. Oh, this is going to be great. Okay, we're going to write this and present it in podcast with plenty of commentary. This is fantastic. All right, yep, let's wrap this.
All right, we'll wrap this up.
See you guys next week. Same time, same place.
Thank you again for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. But in the meantime, just be sure to have a fantastic rest of your day.